Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It was a quiet summer afternoon when I made the discovery. The kind of day where time seems to stretch and the air feels warm and thick, the kind that calls for nothing more than simple wandering. I was at the summer house, a place I often visited to escape the noise of the city. It was far from crowded, nestled on the edge of a quiet forest, with only the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves to keep me company. I had been wandering around the overgrown garden, trying to occupy myself in the silence. The place was always a little eerie, especially when I spent too much time alone there. But that day, as I walked deeper into the yard, I noticed something I had never seen before. Behind a thick wall of ivy, partially covered by a mess of fallen leaves, there was a metal hatch in the ground. It was old, its edges rusted and battered, but the hatch was unmistakable. I bent down to take a closer look. It was strange. How had I never noticed it before? I had been to the summer house dozens of times, and yet this hatch had always been hidden in plain sight. The lid of the hatch was a dull gray, its surface scratched and worn. I brushed aside the leaves and ivy that had accumulated around it, feeling the weight of its history in the rough texture of the metal. There was no sign of a lock, but the hatch was definitely closed. It seemed almost as though it was waiting for someone to open it. To my surprise, the moment I touched it, the rusted handle creaked loudly, almost as if it was alive. With a hesitant hand, I pulled the handle. The hatch opened with a heavy groan, revealing a dark hole below. The light from the afternoon sun barely reached the bottom, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally down into the earth. The air around it felt colder, and for a split second, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. Just a storm drain, probably, I thought to myself, but the words felt hollow. Something was wrong about it. Something wasn't quite right. I could feel my heart rate pick up, my breath growing shallow as I stared into the darkness below. Then, from the depths of the hole, came a sound. A faint whisper, so soft I thought it might have been the wind. But it wasn't the wind. I could hear it clearly now. The whisper, like a distant voice calling me. Come closer. It beckoned. I froze, unsure if I had imagined it. My eyes scanned the surroundings, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the trees, but there was no one. Just the rustling of the leaves and the increasing heaviness of the air. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, though still too faint to make out any real words. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a strange compulsion to move closer. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and walk away, but something held me there. My feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the very earth beneath me had a grip on me. I took a hesitant step forward. The whisper turned into a low hum, vibrating through the air like a faint melody. The darkness in the hole seemed to deepen, drawing me in with an undeniable force. The further I stared, the more I felt an overwhelming pull to enter, as if the very depths of the earth were calling me, urging me to come closer, to see what lay below. Something inside me snapped, and I took another step. Then another. As I lowered myself toward the opening, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, as if the hole itself exhaled, sending a chill through my body. The smell of damp earth mixed with something strange. It was like a mixture of rot and something older, something far more ancient. A smell I couldn't place but couldn't ignore either. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a sense of dread creeping over me like a thick fog. I leaned in closer, and for a moment the darkness seemed to shift, as if the shadows were moving beneath the surface, waiting for something or someone. My eyes strained, but I couldn't make out anything clear in the abyss. Just a void. Endless, cold, and alive? That's when I heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't a distant call. It was right beside me, clear as day. Come down here. A cold wave of panic surged through me. This was no ordinary hole. This wasn't just some abandoned storm drain or forgotten cellar. This was something else, something unnatural. The whisper, no, the voice, was growing louder, pressing against my skull, urging me to obey. I pulled back, stumbling away from the hatch. My heart raced in my chest, and I felt lightheaded, as though the very air had been sucked out of my lungs. I looked around again, hoping for some sign that this was just a figment of my imagination. But there was nothing. No one. Just the silence that had once felt comforting, now suffocating. I stood there for what felt like hours, frozen in place, my hand still trembling where I had touched the hatch. The whisper had stopped, but the unease remained, thick and palpable. And then, just as I thought I had gathered enough courage to move, something moved inside the hole. A shift. A sound. A breath. I froze. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, my body trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. The sound, a low, unsettling rustle, echoed from deep within the hole, and for a moment it felt as though the earth itself had started to breathe. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, to get as far away from that hatch as possible. But I couldn't. My feet were glued to the ground, my breath shallow and rapid, as if the very air was thickening, choking me. And then, the hum returned. It wasn't just a whisper this time, it was louder, more insistent. It vibrated through my bones, sending a cold shiver down my spine. I could almost feel it under my skin, like something was tugging at me, drawing me closer. Come down. The voice was clearer now, almost desperate. It was as though the ground itself was calling to me. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten. I wanted to shout, to run, to tell myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. I stepped forward again, my legs moving without my permission. The hatch's opening loomed before me, dark and uninviting, but I couldn't stop myself. The shadows seemed to stretch outwards, almost as if they were reaching for me. I leaned in closer. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel the ground beneath me shift, as though the earth was shifting with my every movement. My hands shook violently as I gripped the edges of the hatch, staring into the blackness below. The cold air hit my face again, stronger this time, making my skin prickle. Then, without warning, something moved. A shape, no, a figure, shifted in the darkness. For a brief second, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. A dark, shifting silhouette, far deeper than I had first imagined. I gasped and stumbled backward, nearly falling. My heart hammered in my chest as the cold sweat ran down my face. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it, as if something, or someone, was staring right at me from the abyss. My mind screamed for me to leave, to run and never look back. But the voice came again, louder this time, wrapping around me like a vice. Come closer. We are waiting. I backed away slowly, my eyes still locked on the hole. But the darkness seemed to draw closer, as though it was coming out to meet me. I turned quickly, looking over my shoulder at the yard behind me, trying to get my bearings. The trees swayed in the light breeze, the leaves rustling, but everything felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. It was then that I realized there were no birds. No insects. The usual sounds of summer were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that felt unnatural. I strained my ears, waiting for a sound, any sound. But there was nothing. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from the hole. My head snapped back toward the hatch, my eyes wide in fear. I could hear something moving below, something heavy and slow. The ground beneath my feet trembled, as though the very earth was shifting. The sound came again, louder this time, like something crawling from the depths. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. My legs carried me as fast as they could, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged and shallow. But even as I sprinted toward the house, the feeling didn't leave me. The weight in the air, the silence pressing against my mind, it was like something was following me. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, gasping for air. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the lock, securing the door with frantic movements. I leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that nothing had happened, that I had simply imagined everything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The whisper, the figure in the hole, the feeling that something was there, waiting. It was all real. I took a step back from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in the house forever. Eventually, I would have to face whatever was down there. Whatever had been calling me. And I knew, without a doubt, that it was far from over. I could feel its presence, like a dark shadow that hovered just beyond the edge of my sight. It was waiting for me to return. And when I did, I wouldn't be the same. I could already feel it. The change. The uncertainty that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, the creeping dread that I couldn't shake. I didn't know what I had gotten myself into, but I was certain of one thing: I couldn't walk away. I wasn't the same as I had been before. And the hatch was still there. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence. I tried to convince myself that the events I had witnessed by the hatch were nothing more than an overactive imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by isolation. But no matter how hard I tried to push it out of my thoughts, the memory lingered like a shadow, always there, tugging at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. No matter where I went on the property, the trees seemed to loom closer, their branches creaking in the wind, as if they were listening. Every rustle of leaves, every shift in the air made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't escape the sense that something was waiting, that whatever I had disturbed beneath the earth was not finished with me. I spent the next few days in the house, my hands trembling as I tried to do simple tasks, anything to keep my mind occupied. But my thoughts kept returning to the hatch, to the whisper that had called me. The pull was still there, strong and insistent, like a thread that wound through my chest and tugged at my very soul. I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. There was something I needed to understand. I had to face whatever lay below. So, one evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the world outside had been swallowed by darkness, I found myself standing at the edge of the yard again. The silence was even more profound now, the kind of silence that presses against you, fills your ears with the feeling of being utterly alone. I didn't want to go back to the hatch. But I knew I had no choice. The whispers in my mind were growing louder, and I was running out of time. I had to go. I walked toward the spot where the hatch had been, my feet heavy with dread. The familiar rustle of leaves beneath my boots felt alien, like an echo from a past life. When I reached the place where the hatch had been hidden, I froze. It was gone. The spot where it had once been was now just an ordinary patch of earth, undisturbed and empty. I knelt down, my breath catching in my throat. There were no signs of the metal lid, no trace of the hole that had been there just days ago. It was as though it had never existed. But I knew it had. I had seen it. I had touched it. I had heard its call. I stood up slowly, a cold shiver running through me. Where had it gone? Was it some sort of illusion, some trick of the mind? Or was it something else, something that had been hidden for a reason, something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined? As I turned to leave, a sound came from the trees. A sharp crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. My head whipped around, eyes searching the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the silence. Then, the whisper came again. It was faint at first, just a breath on the wind, but it grew louder. Closer. Come down. The words echoed in my mind. I could feel them. They were pulling me, like a magnet drawing me toward the spot where the hatch had been. I looked back at the empty ground. It was as if the earth itself was calling me, urging me to return. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees, my hands scrabbling at the dirt, desperate to uncover whatever had been hidden beneath the earth. My fingers hit something cold. Hard. A metal edge. My heart stopped. I had found it again. The hatch. It had been buried, hidden from view, but it was still there, still waiting for me. I pulled at the edges of the dirt, exposing the rusted metal lid once more. It seemed to pulse with an energy, as though it were alive. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't a voice anymore, it was a presence, a force that filled the air around me. Come closer. I didn't hesitate this time. My hands gripped the rusted handle, and with a force I didn't know I had, I yanked it open. The hatch creaked and groaned, as though protesting the disturbance. Beneath it, the darkness was deeper than I remembered. The void seemed to stretch forever, endless, suffocating. The air was thick, dense with something unexplainable, something that clawed at my thoughts. But something was different this time. I could hear it more clearly now. The sound from within the hole was no longer a whisper. It was a low, guttural growl or rumble that vibrated through the ground. And then I saw it. A shadow. It moved, fluid and unnatural, twisting in the blackness. I couldn't make out its form, but it was there, unmistakable. It was watching me. A pair of glowing eyes appeared from the depths, staring up at me with an intelligence far beyond human understanding. My breath caught in my throat as the figure began to rise from the darkness. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away from the hatch before whatever was coming out reached the surface. But my body refused to obey. I stood frozen, rooted to the spot as the figure continued to rise, a towering silhouette against the blackness. The growl grew louder, vibrating through my chest now. And then, a voice, no longer a whisper, but something far more commanding, spoke from the depths. You should not have come. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. This was a doorway. A doorway to something ancient, something terrifying. And it was opening. The air around me grew thick with an oppressive weight, as though the very atmosphere was pressing in, suffocating me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, a subtle vibration that spread through the earth like a warning. I could feel the eyes watching me, no, staring at me, coming from the depths of the hole. The glowing eyes, now fully visible, were like embers in the dark, burning with a strange, unnatural light. They blinked slowly, as if assessing me, measuring my every move. The growl rumbled again, low and deep, like a warning, a promise of something terrible. For a moment, I felt paralyzed. A part of me wanted to run, to escape before whatever it was in the hole could reach the surface. But another part of me, the part that had come all this way, could not tear myself away. My hands gripped the sides of the hatch tighter, my knuckles white, as I leaned in closer. Then, the figure rose. At first, it was just a vague shape, a shadow that seemed to move against the darkness, its form long and sinuous. But as it continued to emerge, the details became clearer, terrifyingly clear. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied nature. The figure's body was covered in dark, mottled skin that looked like a patchwork of decay, veins and tendrils running beneath the surface like worms writhing in the dirt. Its face was a blur at first, a shifting mass of darkness, but as it drew nearer, the features began to emerge, pale, gaunt, with a mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth and eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural hunger. Its head was disproportionately large for its body, and its neck stretched unnaturally long, like a serpent's, twisting and coiling as it reached toward me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, my body refusing to obey. The figure's eyes never left me, never blinked, as it began to ascend from the hole, dragging itself upwards with a slow, deliberate motion, each movement sending ripples through the air. The growl morphed into a low, gurgling sound, like something wet and monstrous scraping against the sides of the earth. "You should not have come," the voice echoed again, this time not just in my mind, but in the very air around me, vibrating the air in my ears. It was not a voice of flesh, but of something far older, something primal, something that had been buried for eons. I could feel the weight of its words, their meaning sinking deep into my soul. It had been waiting for someone, anyone, to disturb the earth, to open the door. And now, I was here. I took a trembling step backward, my legs weak beneath me, my body shaking with fear. The figure moved again, and I could see it more clearly now, a grotesque form, barely human, twisted and malformed, with eyes that seemed to pierce into me, into my very thoughts. But then, the ground trembled beneath me again, harder this time. The earth seemed to shift, the darkness deepening as the figure rose further. There was a strange, unnatural sound, like the ripping of fabric, followed by a low, bone-chilling hiss. The air grew even colder, and I could feel my breath fogging in the air as the temperature plummeted. The figure was almost fully emerged now, its enormous, twisted limbs reaching toward me, fingers that were long and clawed, scratching the air like a spider's legs searching for prey. It moved with a fluidity that should not have been possible for something so grotesque, its body contorting and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. Then, it spoke again. "You are not alone." The words echoed, reverberating in my chest, sending a shock through my entire body. I felt the earth beneath my feet tremble, and suddenly, I wasn't sure if I was standing on solid ground anymore. The ground seemed to warp, shifting beneath me, as if reality itself was bending. I looked around, desperate for something familiar, anything that could anchor me in the chaos. But the trees were no longer the same. They loomed over me like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The night sky above seemed darker, deeper, as if it was closing in, pulling in all the light around me. Something was moving. It was not just the figure emerging from the hole. No, there were more. Shadows flitted between the trees, darting in and out of the darkness, their shapes too quick, too erratic to make out. I could hear them now, whispers, soft and insistent, like a chorus rising from the earth itself. They were speaking, but I couldn't understand the words. The sounds filled my mind, pushing against my thoughts, drowning out all reason. My body trembled uncontrollably, my knees weak as I looked back at the figure that now stood fully above the hole. It was towering over me, its unnatural form blocking out the little light that remained. The air was thick with dread, suffocating in its intensity. I could feel it in my chest, the pressure mounting, the darkness closing in on me. The figure reached out a hand, no, a claw, toward me, its fingers long and jagged, like a weapon. As it drew closer, I could hear the scraping of its claws against the earth, a sound that made my teeth rattle. Come, the voice whispered, pulling me, pushing me, commanding me to take that final step. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. My mind screamed at me to fight, to run, but it was useless. The darkness was everywhere now, surrounding me, suffocating me. The figure leaned in closer, its cold breath washing over me, filling my lungs with the stench of decay. Its eyes, those burning embers, locked onto mine. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I had already made my choice. I was already part of it. The hole had opened. The earth had awakened. And now, so had I. The last thing I felt was its hand closing around my throat. The darkness was all-consuming. And everything went silent. Then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, the world had changed. I was no longer standing at the edge of the hatch. I was lying on the ground, the earth cold against my skin. My breath was shallow, my body frozen, as if time itself had slowed. The weight of the air around me pressed down harder than before, and I felt a dull ache in my chest, as if something had been torn from me. I couldn't tell how long I had been unconscious, moments, hours, days. But I knew one thing for certain, I was not alone. The darkness that had consumed me was still there, lingering like a shadow, but something was different. The air smelled different, stale, like old earth and decay. I could feel it in my bones, this weight, this presence that had followed me. It was as if it had entered me, taken root in my soul. I tried to sit up, but my body was heavy, sluggish, like I had been drained of every ounce of strength. My arms shook as I pushed myself up, and when my hands met the ground, I felt it, a slight shift beneath my touch. The earth trembled again, but this time it wasn't the figure. It was me. It was inside me. I looked around, the world around me distorted, unfamiliar. The trees were no longer the same. They stood tall, their gnarled branches twisting and writhing like grotesque limbs. The moon hung low in the sky, its light sickly and pale, casting everything in an eerie glow. The familiar landscape of the yard, the small patch of earth that had once been my refuge, had vanished. Instead, I was surrounded by a forest, dark, twisted, and endless. A low, distant growl echoed from somewhere in the depths of the woods, and I froze. It was the same sound I had heard before, the one that had reverberated through the earth, like a warning. But now, it felt closer. Much closer. My heart raced in my chest, and I stood up quickly, my legs unsteady as I tried to make sense of the world around me. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered in the air, as if they had never truly left. The whispers returned, rising from the earth itself, like a chorus of voices. They were still speaking, still calling to me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind, but it was useless. The whispers only grew louder, more insistent, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. And then, as if in response to my panic, a voice broke through the cacophony. Not the growl, not the whispers, but a voice, clear, cold, and unmistakably real. "You belong to us now." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to grasp the meaning. The voice was everywhere, inside me, outside me, echoing in the depths of my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but I couldn't. The weight of their words, of whatever had claimed me, held me in place. I could feel the earth beneath me stirring again, as if it had a will of its own, as if it had been waiting for me. I glanced down at my hands, and that's when I saw it. A mark. It was faint at first, like a shadow on my skin. But as I stared at it, it began to form, etched into my palm, a symbol, twisting and shifting, as if it were alive. I could feel it burning into my flesh, sending waves of heat through my veins. It was as though the mark was a part of me now, a piece of whatever had risen from the hole. The whispers grew louder, the voices intertwining, until they became one, speaking in unison. "You are ours." I gripped my head, trying to block out the voices, trying to shut them out. But it was no use. The mark was there, and it wasn't going anywhere. And neither was whatever had been waiting beneath the earth. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling as I tried to walk. The air was thick now, suffocating, and the forest around me seemed to close in, the trees leaning in, watching. The ground trembled again, a soft vibration beneath my feet, as if the earth itself was alive, breathing. The sound of distant footsteps reached my ears, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind this time. It wasn't my imagination. I wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, dark, and impossibly twisted. Its form was barely human, distorted by something otherworldly, as though it had been shaped by the very darkness itself. The glowing eyes were the first thing I noticed, burning with an unnatural light, piercing through the shadows. It stepped forward, and I could see the sharp, jagged teeth that filled its mouth, the gnarled hands reaching toward me. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But my legs wouldn't move. The mark on my hand pulsed, as if urging me to stay, urging me to follow. My mind screamed to fight, to get away, but the pull was too strong, too overwhelming. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my skin. The touch was cold, like death itself, and for a moment everything went still. The whispers stopped. The trees stopped moving. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the figure spoke. "You are chosen." Its voice was low, gravelly, like the sound of stones grinding against each other. I couldn't understand what it meant, but I felt the weight of its words deep within me. Something inside me shifted, something ancient and powerful, as though I had been marked, chosen for something far greater and far darker than I could comprehend. The ground trembled again, and I felt the air around me change. The shadows deepened. The figure stepped back, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. "Come." It gestured, and the darkness around me seemed to shift, to part, as if clearing the way. A path. A road. One that I could not refuse, no matter how much I wanted to. The mark burned on my hand. And I knew, deep in my soul, that there was no turning back. The forest called to me, and with a single step, I walked into the darkness. Have you ever heard a noise that made you feel like you weren't truly alone, even when you were? A sound that lingers, something so faint at first that you brush it off, but it keeps coming back? That was how it started. A quiet knock, barely audible at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, and more unnerving with each passing night. And it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the walls. It started on the first night after I moved into the old house. It wasn't much, just a simple, two-story home in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place that looked a bit run down, but had character. The sort of house you could imagine having a long history. That was what drew me to it. It wasn't big, and it didn't seem to have much, but I thought it was the perfect place to start fresh. I spent the first few days unpacking, setting up my things, and getting used to the creaks and groans of the house. The old floorboards, the settling of the walls, the sounds of a house that had been standing for decades. But then, on the third night, after I had just finished brushing my teeth and turned off the bathroom light, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic knock. It was coming from the wall near my bed. Not the kind of knock you'd expect from a door or a knock at the window, but something different. It was muffled, like someone tapping gently on the wood from the other side. I froze in place, my hand still on the light switch, listening intently. The sound came again, a soft knock, then another, then silence. At first, I thought it was the house settling. After all, old houses do strange things. But then it happened again, only this time it was louder, more pronounced. The knocks didn't sound like something shifting inside the walls, they sounded like something trying to get out. I convinced myself that I was imagining it. That night, I stayed in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, hoping to drift back to sleep. But the sound kept coming. Each knock was like a finger tapping against my sanity, drawing me closer to the edge. I pulled the blanket over my head, desperate to block it out, but the sound didn't stop. The next morning, I inspected the wall. There was nothing there, no cracks, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. The old house was just creaky, that's all. I told myself that. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It felt like someone, or something, was watching me. By the third night, the knocks were impossible to ignore. They were louder now, more frequent. Sometimes they came at regular intervals, other times they would stop and then start again at random. It felt as though the wall itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with a strange, rhythmic pattern. And then, one night, as I lay in bed, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. The knocks weren't just in the wall, they were following me. It started when I moved to the living room. The knocks echoed through the walls there too, only louder this time. It wasn't just in one place, it was everywhere. I stood in the middle of the room, frozen. The house was empty, yet I felt an overwhelming presence. The knocking grew more intense, faster, as if whatever was on the other side was getting closer. I couldn't explain it. There was no reason for the sound to exist, no logical explanation. And yet, it kept coming. I decided I had to find the source. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, afraid of the dark corners and the sounds that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The next day, I started tearing at the walls. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, maybe a broken pipe, maybe some animal trapped inside. But there was nothing. No sign of anything unusual. That night, the knocks returned, louder than ever. But something had changed. The knocks weren't random anymore, they were synchronized with my movements. Every time I moved, every time I shifted in bed, there was a knock in response. A loud, clear tap. It felt as though it was watching me, following my every move, learning my patterns. I could no longer deny it. Whatever was behind that wall wasn't just making noise, it was aware of me. It was waiting. And I didn't know what to do about it. In the days that followed, I grew increasingly paranoid. I kept the lights on at all times, even during the day. I couldn't focus on anything. The sound was always there, a constant reminder of something just out of reach, something that I couldn't understand. I tried to block it out, tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the more I tried, the louder the knocks became. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were in the floor, the ceiling, the doors. It felt like the house itself was alive, and it was trying to communicate with me, trying to make contact. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. But when I packed up my things, when I tried to leave, something stopped me. The door wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained shut. I yanked at it, panicked, but it wouldn't budge. And then, the knocking came again, louder this time. It echoed in my chest, like a heartbeat, a rhythm I couldn't escape. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, standing just beyond the shadows, was a figure. A tall, thin figure, barely visible, but unmistakable. It was watching me. It wasn't the wall. It wasn't the house. It was someone. And that someone had been there all along. The knocking stopped. And for the first time in days, the silence was suffocating. But now I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The figure didn't move. It stood there, in the corner of the room, just beyond the pool of dim light from the hallway. Its shape was indistinct, like the shadow of something that shouldn't be there. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place. I couldn't make out any details. There was nothing human about it, yet I knew it wasn't some trick of the light. It felt wrong. It felt like it had always been there, hidden in the folds of the house, waiting, watching. I tried to speak, to break the silence, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I took a tentative step back. The floor creaked beneath my weight, a sound that felt too loud in the oppressive quiet. The figure didn't react. I felt the pull of fear, deep, visceral fear, as I turned and yanked at the door handle again. This time, my panic surged, and the door opened slightly before slamming back against its frame. The knocking started again, rhythmic and forceful. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate, trying to drown out my thoughts. I couldn't stay here. Not with it watching. Not with the sound pressing in from all sides. I ran toward the stairs, stumbling over my own feet, desperate to escape whatever was in that room. The second I hit the top step, the door behind me slammed shut, louder than ever, and the knocking stopped, as though waiting for something. Waiting for me. My pulse was a hammer in my ears as I darted into the bedroom, pulling the door shut behind me. I couldn't stay in this house. Not anymore. The air felt thick with something I couldn't name, something sinister, watching. For the first time, I felt trapped. The walls seemed to close in around me, like they were pushing me deeper into their maze. The knocking, I realized, had stopped. But only because something worse was coming. I could feel it. It was only a matter of time before whatever it was made itself known. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart, but the image of the figure stayed in my mind. I could still see it, standing, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. waiting for me to notice it. The knock returned, louder now, and closer. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. I froze, my breath shallow. The sound was coming from inside the room. I turned around, my eyes scanning the dim light for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The space felt suffocating, the shadows too thick, too heavy. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, each thump louder than the last. The knocking continued, coming in slow, deliberate intervals, each tap a cruel reminder that whatever had been watching me now knew I was awake. And it was waiting. The floorboards creaked behind me. I whipped around, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. But there was nothing there. Just the empty space. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. The sound was so faint, so small, like a whisper. A warning. The kind of warning you only hear when it's already too late. I moved slowly, cautiously, toward the closet. I didn't want to, but I couldn't ignore the pull inside me. The need to look, to understand what was happening. I opened the door, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The closet was empty. Nothing out of the ordinary. I closed the door quickly, the sound of the hinges echoing through the stillness. The knocking had started again, louder now. Closer. I didn't know how much longer I could stand this. I felt the weight of the walls pressing in on me, closing around me until there was no escape. Every knock echoed through my chest. Every tap reverberated in my mind. I walked to the window, hoping for some kind of relief, but the street outside was empty. No one was there to hear me. No one would come. I turned back to the room, trying to collect my thoughts. I needed to focus, to figure out what was happening. But then I saw it again, movement from the corner of my eye. Something shifted, something in the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it consume me, but the house, the walls, everything felt wrong now. The knocks were growing more frantic, like they were getting impatient. More than just knocks, they were a warning, a promise. The sound wasn't just inside the room anymore. It was all around me. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were alive, and the knocks weren't coming from one spot anymore. They were coming from everywhere. The house was alive. And it was watching me. I backed away from the window, the air around me growing colder with each passing second. The knocking had become louder, more insistent. It was almost like a heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, drawing me in. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when I checked the screen, there was no signal. Nothing. Just a blank, empty screen staring back at me. I could feel it then, the presence. It was behind me. I knew it without turning around. I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing down on me. With shaking hands, I turned, slowly, unable to resist. The figure was there again, closer this time, standing right in front of me. Its shape was clearer now, not quite human but not completely distorted either. A tall silhouette, thin, elongated, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The knocking stopped. And then the voice came. "I see you." It wasn't spoken aloud, but I heard it. In my mind. The air went cold. The silence that followed felt unbearable. And as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I realized that the knocking hadn't been trying to warn me. It had been trying to call me. And now it had succeeded. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, and my mind was screaming at me to move, to run, to do anything but stand there in the grip of whatever this was. But my feet wouldn't move. My hands trembled at my sides, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. The figure in front of me, no, it wasn't just a figure anymore, it was something else. Something far worse. The voice, if you could even call it that, had been soft, almost like a whisper, but it felt like it had come from deep inside my own mind, reverberating through every part of me. The words echoed in my skull, curling and twisting with a coldness that made my insides churn. I see you. The words repeated in my head, louder this time, not as a whisper, but as a force. A presence. Something that didn't belong, that wasn't supposed to exist. I could feel it wrapping around my mind, pressing on the edges of my thoughts, like it was trying to consume me from the inside. I forced myself to take a step back. One step, then another. But the figure didn't move. It stayed rooted to the spot, watching me with those hollow eyes. The darkness around it seemed to stretch, pulling everything in, absorbing the light. I should have screamed, but my throat was tight, my voice gone. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive, preventing me from calling out, from doing anything. The knocking resumed, but this time it was different. The sound was coming from every direction, inside the walls, under the floorboards, from the ceiling. But it wasn't just knocking anymore. It was growing, changing, like 1,000 tiny hands clawing at the wood, scratching at the air. I turned quickly, trying to escape, but the door I had come through, was gone. Vanished. The frame was empty, the wall seamless, like it had never been there at all. Panic surged through me. There was no way out. The knocking grew louder, more violent now, as if the walls themselves were fighting to break free. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside my head. Inside my very thoughts. Every knock felt like it was pounding against my skull, like it was trying to tear me apart from the inside out. I turned back to the figure. It was closer now. Too close. I've been waiting, the voice whispered again, but this time I felt it all around me. It was no longer just in my head, it was all around me, suffocating me. I could almost hear its breath. The air was thick with something heavy, something that smelled of rot and decay. I wanted to run. To get away from it, from this place, but my legs wouldn't move. I was stuck. I was trapped. The figure's face slowly began to form out of the darkness. At first, it was just a blur, but then it became clearer. Its features were long, twisted, distorted in a way that was unnatural, like a face that shouldn't exist. Its eyes were wide, empty, but blackness inside them endless and deep. It stared at me, unblinking, as if it could see everything I had ever done, everything I had ever feared. The knocking stopped again. But the silence was worse. It was unbearable. The pressure around me increased, the room shrinking, the walls pressing in on me, as if the house was alive and closing in. You can't leave, the figure murmured, and its voice wrapped around me like a thick rope. You can never leave. I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter in my mouth. What did it mean? What did it want from me? I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, but nothing made sense. How could something like this exist? How could I be trapped in a place like this, with no explanation, no escape? And then, the figure spoke again, but this time it wasn't the voice in my head. It was something else, something that sounded far more real, far more physical. "You're mine now," it said, and in that moment, I felt something shift in the room, like the air itself had turned cold and sharp. The very walls seemed to be closing in on me, suffocating me, pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe. I tried to run, to find the door, but there was nothing, no way out, no escape. The walls felt like they were moving, shifting with the rhythm of the knocks that were now pounding at my ears. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold. Ice cold. I spun around, but there was no one there. The figure was still watching me, still standing in front of me, its eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. The knocking had stopped, but I could hear something else now. A low hum, deep and resonant, coming from all around me. It felt like the house was vibrating, like it was alive in ways I couldn't comprehend. "You don't have to be afraid," the voice whispered, as if it could read my thoughts, my every fear. "You're already part of it." A horrible realization settled over me. The house wasn't just a place, it was something else. Something alive. Something that had been here long before I arrived. And now, it had me. Trapped. I tried again to move, to find some escape, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The knocking had started up again, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl, like something was trying to break free from the walls. And then, I felt it, a sharp, cold pain in my chest. I gasped, my vision blurring. It felt like the house was reaching inside me, pulling at my very soul. "You are mine," the figure repeated, its voice growing louder, more forceful. "And now, you will never leave." I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, whatever this thing was, I was no longer in control. The house had me, and I was never going to escape. The pain in my chest intensified, radiating outwards like fire spreading through my veins. I gasped, unable to catch my breath, my legs buckling beneath me as the world tilted. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to distort, bending and twisting as though it, too, were alive. The walls pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were breathing in sync with me, suffocating me with every exhale. The knocking started again, but now it was not a sound, it was a vibration that I felt deep in my bones. It rattled the very foundation of the house, each thud reverberating through the floor and up my spine. It was coming from every direction, as though the house itself was speaking, communicating with something that wasn't human. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't form. My throat was tight, strangled by the pressure of the room closing in on me. I wanted to move, to escape, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, as though the air itself was pressing down on me, holding me in place. And then, through the haze of panic and confusion, I heard the voice again. "It's too late." The words were clear this time, spoken aloud, reverberating in the very air around me. They were followed by a deep, guttural laugh, one that sounded too old, too cruel, to be human. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and louder, until it felt like the laughter was coming from inside my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, trying to escape, but it was everywhere. The laughter, the knocking, the vibrations. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel something cold, something ancient, reaching for me. "You can't run," the voice continued, now a low, mocking whisper. "There's no escape." I opened my eyes, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows moving. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of my vision. But now, they were shifting, undulating, as though they were alive, as though they were reaching for me. And in the shifting darkness, I saw it again, the figure. It was no longer standing still. It was moving, its limbs twitching, jerking in unnatural ways. Its head turned slowly, its hollow eyes never leaving mine. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, and in that instant, I knew that whatever this thing was, it was not just a figment of my imagination. It was real. It was here. And it was waiting for me to make a move. I stumbled backward, my body refusing to obey, my mind clouded with terror. The figure took a step toward me, its movements smooth, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. And the knocking had turned into something else. It was no longer a random sound. It was a rhythm, a pattern, a signal. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere. And in the center of it all, the figure was getting closer, its shadow stretching out across the floor toward me, its presence smothering every corner of the room. "Don't be afraid," the voice said again, this time with a cruel edge to it. "You've already seen too much. You can't go back." I shook my head, the words failing to break through the fog of fear that clouded my thoughts. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But the door, the window, everything was gone. The walls were closing in, tightening around me like a vice, and the air had grown cold, bitter, as though it had frozen in place. The figure was standing in front of me now, its form towering over me, its dark, empty eyes gazing down at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. It was as though the house had become a trap, a prison that I could no longer escape. I tried to move again, my muscles protesting, but it was like pushing against a wall. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was everywhere, in every corner, in every shadow. And the knocking that had started so innocently, had now become the heartbeat of the house itself. The air was thick with something dark and suffocating. I could feel it pressing on me, tightening around my chest, making it harder to breathe. The darkness seemed to grow, wrapping around me like a blanket, until I couldn't see anything but the black void that surrounded me. And then I heard it. A voice. A whisper. "You're not alone." I spun around, but there was no one there. The figure hadn't moved, but the walls were closing in faster now, the knocking louder, the hum deeper, until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with an eerie, unnatural energy. The whisper came again, but this time I knew it wasn't just the figure. There were others. Watching. Waiting. "We're all here. We've always been here." I turned back to face the figure, my breath coming in short gasps. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a presence. It was everywhere, inside my head, inside my body. It had taken root in my soul, and there was no escaping it. The figure tilted its head slightly, the motion too unnatural, too wrong to be human. It smiled then, its lips stretching into a grotesque grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "You've joined us," it whispered, its voice cold and smooth. "You can never leave." I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was trapped. In my mind, in the house, in this nightmare that was slowly becoming my reality. There was no escape. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the knocking stopped. Everything went silent. The air was still. The darkness was still. The figure was still. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed against me, thick and heavy, like the very air had turned to lead. My body trembled uncontrollably, but my mind was too numb to react. I couldn't process what had happened, what was happening. The walls felt like they were closing in, but in the eerie stillness, there was nowhere to run. The figure stood motionless in front of me, its grotesque smile still stretched wide. Its eyes, black and hollow, never left mine. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was reading my every thought, my every fear, peeling away the layers of my mind until there was nothing left. The knocking had stopped. But now, something else was growing, something more insidious, something deeper than the sound that had plagued me. It was a presence, a pressure that filled the space around me, pressing down on me until I felt like I might suffocate. The house was alive. I could feel it. It was alive, and it was hungry. Please. I whispered, the word barely leaving my mouth. My voice was hoarse, as though I hadn't spoken in days. What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer immediately. It simply watched me with its unblinking eyes, its smile widening until it was grotesque, almost painful to look at. Everything, the figure whispered at last, its voice so soft, so chilling, that it sent a jolt of ice through my veins. You are part of it now. You have always been part of it. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. No, this wasn't real. None of this could be real. It couldn't be. I was losing myself, losing grip on what was real and what was just madness. But then the walls, they began to shift again. I watched, wide-eyed, as the wood seemed to breathe, the boards creaking and groaning as if something was pushing from the other side. A low, guttural sound emanated from deep within the house, a vibration that rattled my bones. The air grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath puff out in front of me, thin wisps of white in the darkness. Then, I heard it. The sound I had been dreading all along. A soft, faint whisper. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many. We are here. The whisper echoed through the room, coming from every direction, from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. My head spun as I tried to make sense of the words, but it was impossible. It was like being surrounded by 1,000 voices, each one more distorted than the last, each one a part of the darkness that was consuming me. We've been here. I turned, my heart pounding, as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move. They slithered along the walls, merging, converging, until they took shape. A figure. Another figure. A dozen figures. Their faces were indistinguishable, just dark silhouettes with wide, empty eyes, but I could feel their presence, feel them watching me, feel them waiting. The knocking started again, but this time it was different. It was no longer a sound. It was a rhythm, a beat, a heartbeat. And I realized then, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, that it wasn't the house that was alive, it was me. The figure in front of me laughed. It was a deep, low sound that reverberated through the room, shaking me to my core. You're mine, it said, its voice smooth and cold, just like the others. Just like all of us. I wanted to scream, to fight, to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped, bound by the house, by the shadows, by the very essence of whatever it was that had been waiting here, waiting for me. You can't leave, it whispered again, its face leaning closer, its eyes piercing mine. You are part of the house now. You always were. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward me, reaching for me, pulling me in. The house was consuming me, devouring me piece by piece. The more I resisted, the tighter the grip became. I gasped for air, but it was like trying to breathe underwater. The pressure was unbearable. The knocking, the whispers, the laughter, they all blended together into a cacophony that drowned out everything else. And then, just when I thought I would be swallowed whole, when the last ounce of my will was about to break, I saw it. A door. It was small, just a crack in the wall, barely noticeable among the shifting shadows. But it was there, and it was real. My heart raced. I moved toward it, my body heavy, my steps unsteady, but I had to. I reached for the handle. It was cold, slick with moisture, but it turned in my hand, and the door creaked open. And then, nothing. The knocking stopped. The shadows faded. The figure was gone. The room was silent. I stood there, my chest heaving, my mind reeling. Was I free? Had I escaped? But then, I heard it again. A soft knock. Faint, but unmistakable. A single, quiet knock. And in that moment, I realized the truth. It would never end. The house had me. I had always been part of it. And it would never let me go. The knocking continued, growing louder as I stepped back into the darkness, knowing that this was only the beginning. And that, perhaps, it had all been waiting for me all along. Have you ever heard a sound in your house that you couldn't explain? One that made your skin crawl, but when you searched, there was nothing there? I had. And it changed everything. It started quietly, just a faint scratching or scuffling from above. The kind of noise you might dismiss if you were busy with something else. But over time, the noises grew. They weren't just faint anymore. They were louder, more insistent, like something or someone was moving around up there in the attic. I remember the first night it really caught my attention. I was home alone, trying to wind down after a long day of work. It was late, the kind of quiet that only comes when the house is completely still. Then, just as I settled into my chair, I heard it again. A soft thud, followed by what sounded like the dragging of something heavy across the floor above me. I froze. The sound wasn't new, but tonight it felt different. There was a deliberate rhythm to it, almost like someone was pacing. Or worse, searching for something. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was just the house settling. But when it happened again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. For days, the sounds persisted, always when I was alone, always when I least expected it. Sometimes it was just the rustling of something being moved. Other times it was sharp, distinct knocks, like someone was hammering on the floorboards above. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old rodent or some structural issue. But every night, the noise became more unnerving. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know what was causing it. It was a Saturday afternoon when I finally made up my mind to investigate. The house felt eerily quiet that morning, almost like it was waiting for something to happen. I stood at the base of the attic stairs, staring up into the darkness. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed slowly, each step making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air in the attic was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. I flipped the light switch, but the bulb flickered and buzzed, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The attic felt colder than the rest of the house, as if the space had been untouched for years. My breath misted in the cold air, and I shivered involuntarily. I searched the room carefully, my eyes scanning the corners, the rafters, the stacks of old boxes. The place was a mess, filled with forgotten things from the past. A broken chair, some old furniture covered in sheets, an old dresser. But nothing unusual. No sign of whatever had been making the noises. Then, I saw it. In the far corner, half hidden behind a pile of old blankets and suitcases, there was a large, battered trunk. It wasn't anything I recognized from before. It seemed out of place, like it had been left there on purpose. Curiosity mixed with a sudden chill that ran down my spine as I approached it. The trunk was heavy, and the lock was rusted shut, but it didn't seem like it had been tampered with. I reached down, hands trembling, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, I found a stack of old letters. Their edges were yellowed with age, their paper thin and brittle. The first thing I noticed was that they were all addressed to me. My name was written in neat, precise handwriting on the front of each envelope. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled one out, slowly tearing it open. I could hardly breathe as I unfolded the paper. The writing was familiar, yet strangely unsettling. It read, "I know you're here. I know you found me. You are part of this now. You will understand soon." I dropped the letter as if it had burned me. My mind raced. How could this be? These letters were for me, except I had never seen them before. The handwriting was mine, but not mine. The words, the message. It felt like a warning. I looked inside the trunk again, my eyes scanning the other letters. The same handwriting, the same cryptic messages. And then, as I reached for the last envelope at the bottom of the trunk, something caught my eye. A small, faded photograph. I picked it up, feeling my blood run cold as I stared at the image. It was a photo of me, standing in my very attic, holding the trunk. But the photo was old. I looked younger, much younger. And I didn't remember ever being in this attic, let alone holding that trunk. My mind reeled. This was impossible. Suddenly, the noise started again. The same scuffling, the same dragging sound. Only now, it was closer. Closer than before. I turned around, heart pounding, eyes scanning the dark attic for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Nothing but the eerie stillness. The letters, the photo, they had to mean something. But I couldn't understand it. I couldn't put it all together. And then I heard it, louder now. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough that it sent a chill down my spine. You were always meant to find it. The door to the attic slammed shut behind me, cutting off the light. I was trapped. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, and the noise, it was getting louder. I could feel something moving behind me, something, or someone. But when I turned, there was nothing there. And then, in the silence that followed, I knew that whatever was in this attic, whatever had been waiting here, was not finished with me yet. I tried to keep my composure as panic clawed at the edges of my mind. The silence in the attic felt suffocating, but the whispers, the soft, deliberate words, kept echoing in my ears as if they were coming from all around me. You were always meant to find it. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably clear. And it was as if it knew something I didn't. I stood frozen, my breath shallow and rapid, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The attic had always felt cold and eerie, but now it felt alive, like it was watching me. The shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting as if they had a will of their own. I tried to take a step back, but my legs felt like lead. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. I turned around, looking for an escape. The stairs, the only way out, were behind me, but the space between me and them felt like miles. The door had slammed shut with a force I couldn't explain. I rushed toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I reached for the knob, it wouldn't turn. It was as if the door was stuck, frozen in place by some unseen force. The noise, the scraping, the dragging, came again, now louder than before. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to surround me, echoing through the walls. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. This was no ordinary noise. This was something else, something unnatural. I spun around, my eyes scanning the attic in a frenzy. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, a figure, standing near the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, too tall, and its form was indistinct, like smoke swirling in the darkness. My heart stopped. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its gaze fixed on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel its intentions, dark, malevolent, and unmistakably directed at me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back to the door, desperate to escape. The noise was getting louder, more insistent. Whatever was out there, it was closing in. I pulled at the door again, this time with all my strength. It didn't budge. Panic surged through me as I slammed my shoulder into the door, trying to force it open. But it was no use. It was as if the space itself was holding me in place, trapping me with whatever that thing was. Then I heard the voice again, closer now, whispering just behind me. You shouldn't have opened it. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, but the figure was gone. The room was empty. I stood there, alone in the suffocating darkness, my mind racing. Was I imagining things? Was it the stress? Or had I really heard something? Seen something? I glanced down at the trunk, still sitting open in the corner. The letters were scattered across the floor, their edges curling as if they were alive. The photograph was still in my hand, but now it felt heavier, as though it had a weight to it that it hadn't had before. I stumbled toward the trunk, my hand shaking as I grabbed the photo once more. The image still showed me, standing there, in the attic, holding the trunk. But something was different about it. The photo seemed wrong. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of it, when I noticed something in the background. Something I hadn't seen before. A face. A pale, ghostly face, half obscured by shadows, but unmistakably there. It was staring directly at me, its eyes wide, filled with something like hunger. I dropped the photo, my breath coming in short gasps as I backed away from the trunk. The figure, the face, it was all connected. But to what? I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But as I turned back toward the door, a low, rumbling sound began to fill the room, like the very walls of the attic were shaking. The light flickered violently above me, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. I ran toward the stairs, but before I could reach them, the entire attic seemed to shift. The floor creaked underfoot, the walls groaning as if they were closing in on me. My body tensed, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, began to echo through the attic, each step growing louder, closer, until it felt as though someone was standing right behind me. I turned, my heart pounding in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, oppressive silence. Yet I could feel it. Something was watching me, waiting for me. And then, from somewhere deep in the attic, came a sound that made my blood run cold. A whisper. It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was older. It was raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. And it was coming from behind the walls. Get out, while you still can. I froze. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. It was so close, I could almost feel it, like it was right next to my ear. My body trembled with fear as I scrambled to my feet, desperately trying to escape, to get out of the attic and away from whatever was in there with me. But as I reached for the door again, something stopped me. The handle was gone. The door, once so solid and real, was now just a seamless wall. It had vanished, leaving nothing but bare wood where it had been moments before. I was trapped. Again. And this time, I wasn't alone. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space where the door had once been. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. I was sure I hadn't imagined it. The door had been there moments ago, and now it was gone, like it had never existed. The noise started again. The scraping, the dragging. But this time, it was different. It was more rhythmic, deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving in the walls. My breath caught in my throat as the sound grew louder, closer, as though whatever was behind those walls was coming for me. I turned in every direction, searching for an escape. But the attic felt like a labyrinth, the walls closing in on me. The space that had once seemed like a refuge, a place where I could store my old things and forget about the world, now felt like a cage. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, the sound mixing with the ever-present scraping. Was it in my head? Was I going mad? I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. No. I had to stay focused. I had to find a way out. I stumbled over to the small window at the far end of the attic. It was too high to reach without a ladder, but I needed to see what was outside. Maybe there was someone out there who could help. I stood on tiptoe, trying to peer through the dusty glass, but the view was blocked by an overgrown tree that had grown so tall it now obscured the world outside. The scraping continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. My stomach twisted with dread as the growl grew louder, more insistent, until it was vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. I backed away from the window, feeling the air grow thick with tension. I could feel it again, the presence. Something watching me, lurking in the shadows. The attic felt alive with it, the very air pulsing with an unnatural energy. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help, anything I could use to escape this nightmare. I returned to the trunk, desperate to make sense of the letters, the photo, the strange connection to this place. I hadn't noticed before, but there was something written on the back of the photo. I flipped it over, my hands trembling as I read the faded ink. You are the last. No one will come for you. The words sent a chill down my spine. What did it mean? I ran my fingers over the edges of the photo, the paper now feeling colder than before. I turned it back over, looking once again at the image. There it was again, the face, pale and gaunt, staring back at me from the shadows. I felt the walls close in. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could hear my breath coming in shallow gasps. The growl from the walls had stopped, replaced by a soft tapping. It was as if something was trying to communicate with me from within the darkness. A chill ran down my spine as the tapping grew more rhythmic, almost like a countdown. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But I couldn't just stand there forever. I had to find a way out. I took a deep breath and looked around the attic again, searching for anything, any way to escape. That's when I noticed it. A small, barely visible crack in the far wall, just below the window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing as I ran my fingers along the crack. It was cold to the touch, as if something icy were on the other side. The tapping sound started again, louder now, more urgent, as if it knew I was close to something. My hand trembled as I pushed against the crack. To my surprise, it gave way slightly, revealing a narrow gap. I didn't know what was on the other side, but I couldn't stay here. Not with the growling, the tapping, and that dark presence lurking in the shadows. I squeezed my hand into the gap, pulling at the wall. It shifted, groaning under the pressure, until the crack widened just enough for me to squeeze through. I hesitated for a moment, my mind screaming at me to stop, to think this through, but the growling came again, louder now, almost directly behind me. The air was thick with something malevolent, and I couldn't take it any longer. I crawled through the gap, squeezing my body through the narrow opening. The sound of my clothes scraping against the rough stone filled my ears, drowning out everything else. Finally, I tumbled into what seemed like another space, a small, dark room hidden behind the wall. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't know where I was, but it felt different. Quieter, less oppressive. I slowly got to my feet, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was empty, completely empty, save for an old, wooden door at the far end. The walls were bare, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. I wasn't sure if this place had been there the whole time, or if it had appeared just now, in response to my desperation. I approached the door cautiously, my pulse quickening. I had to know what was beyond it. But as my hand reached for the doorknob, I froze. There was a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the other side. It was the same voice. The voice from the attic. "You can't escape, not yet." My breath caught in my throat, and I pulled my hand back, suddenly afraid to open the door. What waited for me on the other side? The whisper echoed in my ears, reverberating off the walls of the small room as I stood frozen. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave the door unopened and escape this place. But my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. Something inside me told me I needed to face whatever was waiting behind that door. I hesitated, looking around the room one last time. The shadows seemed to move, swirling in the corners as though they were alive, watching, waiting. The air had thickened again, oppressive and cold, and I could feel the temperature dropping. Every instinct in my body was telling me to leave, but something, some twisted curiosity, compelled me to press on. I reached for the doorknob again, my fingers trembling. As I twisted it, the door creaked open, the sound too loud in the stillness of the room. My breath hitched as the space beyond the door was revealed. It was another narrow corridor, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were made of old brick, covered in layers of grime and dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I stepped into the hallway. A chill ran down my spine, and I could feel my skin crawl as I looked down the passageway. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed in the distance. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps seemed to be coming closer, but there was no one in sight. It was as if the sound was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, the rhythmic pace of someone following me, always just out of reach. I turned and looked back, half expecting the door to slam shut behind me, but it remained open, the faint light from the attic spilling into the corridor. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether to turn back or keep moving forward. The growl from before, the one that had been so close in the attic, seemed to reverberate through the walls now, echoing in the distance. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and began walking down the corridor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of something unseen was pressing against me. The air grew thicker with each passing moment, suffocating me, pulling me further into the darkness. The further I went, the more the footsteps seemed to grow louder, closer. I could hear them now, clear as day, slow, deliberate, almost mocking in their rhythm. But no matter how hard I searched, I couldn't see anyone. My heart raced, and panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. The corridor twisted ahead of me, growing narrower, and I felt the walls closing in. I had no idea where I was going, or even what I was looking for. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. I couldn't let whatever was behind me get closer. I pressed forward, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. But the footsteps, they were unmistakable now. They were right behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. It was as if the air itself was becoming denser, colder. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead of me, stepping out of the shadows. I froze, my body going rigid with fear. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and its face was hidden in the shadows. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if studying me, its presence weighing down on me like an anchor. The footsteps behind me stopped. The silence in the corridor was deafening. "Do you remember?" the figure's voice rasped, low and distant. I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, my mouth too parched to speak. "You shouldn't have come here," it continued. "This place isn't what you think. It's always watching." I took a step back, feeling the walls close in around me, my back hitting the cold, rough surface of the stone. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away if the figure hadn't already noticed me trembling. It reached out, its hand stretching toward me, long fingers reaching through the shadows. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the uneven floorboards, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was too real, too close now. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, undulating like something alive. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like ice sliding down my spine. "Not until you understand." I spun around, ready to run, but the corridor ahead of me had changed. What had once been a passageway leading to the unknown had now turned into a wall of solid stone, the light at the end of it extinguished. There was no way forward. Only the figure, the darkness, and the whispers that grew louder, now turning into screams, echoes of lost souls begging for release. I turned again, desperate to find another way out. But there was no escape. Only the cold grip of the figure's presence wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the shadows. The walls began to move, closing in tighter with every passing second. "You can't hide," the voice whispered, just inches from my ear. "You're already part of it." The ground beneath my feet seemed to vanish, and I fell into nothingness, the screams and whispers swallowing me whole. And then, nothing. I woke up, or at least I think I did. It was hard to tell if I had truly escaped or if I was still trapped in that suffocating place. My body ached, and my mind was foggy, struggling to piece together what had just happened. I was lying on the cold floor of the attic, the same dusty wooden boards beneath me that I had fallen asleep on earlier. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I wondered if I had simply imagined it all, the dark figure, the corridor, the feeling of being watched. But as I pushed myself up from the floor, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The old suitcase was gone. It wasn't where I had left it. I stood up shakily, my mind racing. Had I dreamed it? Had I taken the letters out of the suitcase? But no, I remembered the unmistakable sound of that old, brittle paper crinkling under my fingers. I'd read those letters, or at least tried to. They had been so strange, filled with warnings, cryptic messages about people I didn't know. And yet, the handwriting had felt familiar. I turned around, scanning the dimly lit attic once more, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything that made sense. The shadows seemed to move in unnatural ways, but nothing was there. The room looked just as it had when I entered, untouched, unchanged. I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, and for a moment, I felt something on the back of my neck, cold fingers, like a chill running down my spine. I spun around quickly, but there was no one. There was no sign of anyone or anything unusual. But then the whispers started again. Soft at first, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't like before, where the voices had been distant and ethereal. This time, the sound was sharper, closer, more real. It was as though the room itself was speaking to me, calling out my name. I froze. "Can you hear it now?" the voice rasped from the corner. "Can you feel it watching you?" The air in the attic grew thick once more, the temperature dropping rapidly. I shivered uncontrollably, my breath forming visible clouds in the freezing air. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make sense of the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was warning me. The attic door behind me creaked open slowly, as though it were being pulled by an invisible hand. My heart leapt in my chest, and I turned toward the door, not sure if I wanted to face what was on the other side, or if I could run before whatever was about to happen. I moved cautiously, each step forward a battle against the mounting fear that gripped me. As I reached the door, I hesitated, listening carefully for any sign of what lay beyond. The whispers were now replaced by an eerie stillness, the kind that presses on you, urging you to turn back, to run. But I couldn't turn back. Something inside me, something deep and unsettling, told me that there was no escape anymore. No matter how far I ran, the shadow would always follow. I opened the door with a creak. The hall beyond was dark, the same dark corridor I had seen before, stretching out endlessly. But this time, there was something different. The walls seemed to shift, like they were closing in. The flickering light bulb above hummed ominously, casting a sickly glow on the walls. And then, I saw it. In the farthest corner of the hallway, a figure stood, its face still obscured by shadow. The faintest movement caught my eye. It was reaching out, like a hand beckoning me forward. I stepped back, my heart racing as I stumbled away from the door. I couldn't move fast enough. The figure was closer now, no longer distant. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed down the hallway toward me. I turned, running back into the attic, slamming the door behind me. But it didn't help. The whispers were already inside, in my head, in my chest, suffocating me. I turned to the far corner of the room, my eyes wide with terror. The suitcase had returned, now sitting open on the floor, the papers spilling out like they were waiting for me. I could hear my name being called out, repeated over and over again, louder this time. I walked toward the suitcase, my body moving as though controlled by something other than myself. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls closing in once again. The letters, the same ones I had read before, stared up at me as though they had been waiting for me to finish reading them. But as I reached down to pick them up, I realized something. The letters weren't the same. The handwriting was different, familiar, but not mine. The words had changed. And as I scanned them, I realized what they said. You're part of it now. You will never leave. Suddenly, I felt the cold, invisible hands wrap around me, pulling me toward the center of the room. I screamed, trying to break free, but the darkness swallowed me whole. The floor beneath me cracked open, and I fell through into the black void. There was no escape. Have you ever found something that completely changes the way you see your life? Something that was hidden, forgotten, waiting to be discovered? That's how it all began for me, with a simple box of old letters. But nothing about it was simple. Those letters, written by my father to someone I didn't know, didn't just change my perspective, they unraveled something far darker than I could have imagined. It all started one rainy afternoon while I was going through some old things in the attic. My father had passed away several years ago, and after his death, I didn't really have much of an urge to go through his belongings. But that day, I had a strange sense of curiosity. The dusty smell of the attic filled my nostrils as I rummaged through the boxes, trying to make some sense of what I should keep and what I should throw away. That's when I found it. A small wooden box, tucked away in the corner of the attic. The box was unmarked, with no indication of its contents. When I opened it, I was met with the familiar sight of yellowed paper. Letters. At first, I thought they were just old correspondence from his work or maybe old bills, but something about them caught my eye. They were addressed to someone named Catherine, a name I had never heard before. As I began to read the first letter, I realized that these weren't just ordinary letters. The handwriting was meticulous, elegant, as if my father had carefully chosen each word. The first few lines were typical enough, a polite greeting, a simple inquiry about someone's health. But then, as I read on, the tone of the letter began to shift. There was a subtle unease creeping into his words, an unease that I couldn't quite place. My father had never been a man to show much emotion, let alone unease. The letter was short but unsettling. It spoke of changes and things that should remain buried. It mentioned something about darkness following and not being able to escape the past. I didn't know what to make of it. It didn't seem like something my father would write, at least not to someone I didn't know. But as I flipped through the remaining letters, one after another, they grew progressively darker. There were mentions of strange occurrences, noises in the night, things moving on their own, people who shouldn't have been there. The further I went, the more agitated the tone became, until the last letter I read was almost frantic, as though my father was warning Catherine of something terrible. The most chilling part was the closing line of the final letter. It was almost like a plea, written in shaky handwriting. I fear it is too late. It is already here. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at those words, trying to understand what they meant. What was too late? And what was it that had already arrived? I felt a shiver run down my spine as I closed the box. I couldn't shake the feeling that the letters were meant for me. That somehow, the events my father had written about were tied to me, to my family. I knew I had to find out more, but the deeper I went into this mystery, the more I felt like I was crossing a line I couldn't return from. As I stood there in the dimly lit attic, holding the box in my hands, I heard something. A sound that made my blood run cold. A soft scratching noise, coming from the wall behind me. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. Just the old, creaking wood of the house. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew something had changed. And whatever it wasn't going to let me rest until I uncovered the truth. The scratching continued. Closer now. And in that moment, I realized that the letters were only the beginning. Something was watching me. Something from the past had awakened, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I should have stopped right then, put the box back, and left it alone. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt compelled to continue, to uncover what my father had been trying to tell me. What he had been trying to warn me about. And so, I did the only thing I could do. I followed the trail of forgotten letters into the dark corners of my father's past, knowing that whatever I found would change everything. But I wasn't prepared for what I would uncover. I couldn't stop thinking about the letters. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the final line, "I fear it is too late. It is already here." What was it? What had my father been writing about? And why had he never mentioned any of it to me? The next morning, I woke up with a sense of urgency I couldn't shake off. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by sitting around. The box of letters was still in the attic, tucked away safely, but I knew that was only the beginning. My father had written to Catherine, but why? And why had he stopped? These questions gnawed at me. I decided to go back to the attic, determined to find something more. The box itself was too small to contain everything. There had to be more. My footsteps echoed through the empty house as I made my way upstairs. The sun hadn't risen yet, leaving the attic dim and cold. I tried to steady my breath, but my heart was racing. Something didn't feel right. I searched the entire attic, moving boxes, old furniture, and piles of forgotten memories. My father had been meticulous, leaving nothing behind except for his memories, except for the letters. But still, there was nothing else. No more letters, no hidden messages. It was all just ordinary, old junk. Frustrated, I sat down on the dusty wooden floor, my head in my hands. Maybe I was overthinking this. Maybe it was just some old, cryptic correspondence that meant nothing. I had always been prone to making mountains out of molehills. But something told me this wasn't one of those times. That's when I heard it again. The faint scratching sound coming from the wall. It was softer this time, almost like a whisper in the stillness of the attic. My pulse quickened. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the sound, my breath shallow and uneven. The wall was old, worn with age, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I leaned in closer to the wall where the noise had been coming from, pressing my ear to it. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. I was about to pull away when I heard it again, a faint, scraping sound, like something trying to break free from behind the wall. I recoiled, stepping back in shock. I had to admit it now, the noise wasn't natural. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. And I knew, deep in my gut, that it was connected to my father. I quickly ran downstairs, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen and a crowbar from the garage. If there was something hidden behind the wall, I was going to find it. I returned to the attic, my heart pounding, my mind racing. My hands were shaking as I pried the crowbar between the old floorboards, trying to loosen them. The smell of mildew and age filled the air as I worked, sweat dripping from my brow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to lift a large floorboard. Beneath it was a small cavity in the wall, barely big enough to fit my hand through. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. What was I about to uncover? With trembling fingers, I reached into the gap. My flashlight illuminated a small, tattered envelope. It was yellowed with age, sealed with what looked like old wax. I could barely make out the faint markings on it, but one thing was clear: the name on the envelope was my father's. I pulled it out slowly, my hands trembling. The envelope was addressed to Catherine, just like the letters in the box. But there was something different about this one. It was heavier. And as I turned it over, I noticed something odd. There was no return address. No indication of where it had come from. I ripped it open and pulled out the letter inside. It was written in my father's familiar handwriting, but this one was different. This letter was more urgent, more desperate. The words seemed to spill out onto the page, almost as if he had written them in a hurry. Catherine, it's happening. I don't know how, but it's coming. The thing we've been trying to stop, it's not gone. It's never left. I can hear it now, moving in the walls. It's waiting. It knows we're here. It's getting closer. I fear it's already in the house. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight as I read the words over and over again, trying to make sense of them. What was he talking about? What thing was he referring to? And why hadn't he ever told me any of this? I turned the letter over to see if there was anything on the back, anything that might explain what was happening. That's why I saw it. A single, cryptic line written hastily in the corner of the page: "Don't trust the house. It's watching." My heart stopped. The house. It's watching. Those words echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, I felt the walls closing in around me. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And then, from behind me, I heard the sound again. A soft scratching, like nails on wood, coming from deep within the house. It was closer this time. So much closer. I turned around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the emptiness of the attic, the weight of the silence hanging heavy in the air. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't imagining it. The house was alive. And it was watching me. Just like my father had warned. The silence in the attic was suffocating. My breath came in short, quick gasps as I gripped the flashlight, my knuckles white with the pressure. I stood frozen, staring into the dark corners of the room, my mind racing. It's watching. The words from my father's letter echoed through my head, growing louder with every passing second. The house. It's watching. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But the fear that had gripped me was too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house was no longer just a home, but something alive. I looked around the attic again, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. But still, nothing. Just dust, boxes, and the haunting silence. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. My father's letters, the strange noise in the walls, the warning in the letter, it was all connected. There was something hidden in this house, something my father had known, something he had tried to stop. But what? I shoved the letter back into my pocket, quickly descending the stairs. The house seemed to close in around me as I moved. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were pressing against me. I tried to ignore it, but the sensation only grew stronger the further I went. I could feel the eyes of the house on me, watching my every move. I made my way to the basement, hoping that I could find something there, something that would help me understand what was going on. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended into the darkness below. The basement was cold and damp, the smell of mildew thick in the air. I flicked on the light, and the single bulb flickered weakly before illuminating the room. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. It looked like any other basement, except now, to me, it felt like a crypt. I had the eerie sensation that I was not alone down here. The air was heavy, as if something ancient and restless lurked just out of sight. I pushed the thought aside and began sifting through the piles of old junk, looking for anything that might give me a clue. I wasn't sure what I was searching for, perhaps more letters, a journal, some kind of evidence. Anything that might explain my father's strange behavior, the warnings he had written, and the strange noise in the house. As I rummaged through a stack of boxes, something caught my eye, an old, dusty trunk tucked in the corner. It was locked, the key long lost to time. But something about it felt important. My father had kept it hidden, and now, for some reason, it was calling to me. I approached the trunk cautiously, my hands shaking as I ran my fingers over the rough wood. It felt solid, weighty, as though it contained something significant. But why had my father kept it locked away? I looked around the basement for anything I could use to open the trunk, but there was nothing. No tools, no spare keys. Then I remembered the crowbar upstairs. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I quickly ran back to the attic, grabbed the crowbar, and returned to the basement. My hands trembled as I wedged the crowbar between the lid and the base of the trunk, prying it open. The metal creaked in protest, but after a few moments, the lock gave way, and the lid popped open with a heavy thud. Inside, there were more letters, hundreds of them. But there was something else. An old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was worn, the title faded, but I could make out the faint imprint, The Watcher. I reached for the book, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine as I opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings, diagrams of eyes, watching from the darkness. At first, I thought it was some kind of occult text, but as I flipped through the pages, I realized that it wasn't just a book. It was a journal. My father's journal. The first entry was dated years ago, long before I was born. It was written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. It's happening. The thing is getting stronger. I can feel it watching, even when I sleep. I thought I could stop it, but now I'm not so sure. It's everywhere, moving in the shadows, in the walls. I hear it at night, when the house is quiet. I hear it breathing. My heart raced as I read the words. The same feeling of being watched, the same fear of something in the house. It was all connected. But what was this thing? And why had my father never told me about it? I flipped to the next page, desperate for answers. But the words on the page made my blood run cold. I've seen it now. It's real. I don't know how it got here, but I know it's not leaving. It's taken everything from me. It's inside the house, and it's inside me. I don't know how to stop it. I don't know if I even want to. I slammed the book shut, a chill creeping over me. The house, the letters, my father's journal, there was something here. Something evil that had been watching, waiting. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it had been waiting for me all along. I sat there, staring at the closed book, my mind reeling from the weight of the revelation. It's alive. The words echoed in my head like a broken record. My father had known. He had been fighting something that had infected the house, and now it was coming for me. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave this place, forget everything, and never return. But the letters, the journal, it was too late to back out now. I needed answers. I couldn't let whatever had claimed my father's sanity claim mine too. The silence in the basement was deafening, suffocating. The only sound was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. I glanced nervously around the room, as though the very walls might be listening, watching. The house felt different now, as though it were a living, breathing entity waiting for the right moment to strike. I could feel its presence, its hunger, creeping closer with each passing second. I stood up, suddenly aware of how small I felt in the vast, dark basement. The temperature had dropped again, and I could see my breath in the air. I quickly shoved the journal and letters into my bag, not wanting to leave them behind. The trunk was still open, the contents now exposed to the air. I didn't dare touch it again. The dark energy that seemed to radiate from it was too much to bear. I moved toward the stairs, but as I reached the first step, I heard it. A soft creak from above. A groan of the floorboards. Someone, or something, was up there. My breath hitched, and my hand instinctively gripped the railing. I told myself it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I hesitated, frozen at the foot of the stairs, my mind racing. Should I go up there? Investigate? Or should I leave, take the journal, and never come back? But I knew the answer already. The house was drawing me in, like a spider luring its prey into a web. I stepped up the stairs slowly, my footfalls too loud in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, the sound of the stairs groaning beneath my weight almost drowned out by the thudding of my own heart. As I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. The house was so still, so quiet, except for that soft, rhythmic creaking from somewhere above. I walked cautiously toward the attic door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. The cold air from the attic seeped through the cracks, sending a shiver down my spine. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to open the door. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, the sound of old hinges protesting against the movement. The attic beyond was dark, shrouded in shadows, and for a moment I stood there, staring into the blackness, unsure of what I was about to find. The noise had stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a brief moment I thought I had imagined it all. But then I saw something move, a flicker in the corner of my vision, something shifting. I stepped into the attic, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my weight. My flashlight beam swept over the room, illuminating old furniture and piles of forgotten belongings. But then I saw it, a figure standing near the far wall, almost hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It was a person. Or it looked like one. The figure stood perfectly still, motionless. I couldn't make out any features, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. My heart raced, and my palms began to sweat. I stepped forward cautiously, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I moved closer. "Hello?" My voice barely broke the silence. It felt strange to speak, as if any sound would shatter the fragile stillness that hung in the air. There was no response. I was about to turn and leave, my mind screaming at me to get out of the attic, when the figure shifted. Slowly, as though it were alive, slowly, deliberately. It took a step forward, and in that moment, I saw it clearly. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something dark, something wrong. The figure was a silhouette, a shadow that had taken form, but there was no face, no details. Just darkness. It wasn't moving like a human, it was gliding, shifting in and out of the shadows. And then I heard it. The whisper. A voice, soft and faint, but unmistakable. Come closer. I froze, unable to move. My body was locked in place, my mind screaming to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. The darkness seemed to pulse, to breathe in time with my own ragged breath. The figure stepped closer, and I felt the air grow colder, heavier. Please, I whispered, my voice shaking. What do you want? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, a hand, or something that resembled one, extended toward me. Its fingers were elongated, twisted, like branches reaching for prey. The shadow hovered inches from my face, and I could feel the cold emanating from it, as though it were alive, as though it were feeding on my fear. Suddenly, the attic light flickered and went out. Darkness. I was plunged into total blackness. The whispering stopped, but the presence, that feeling of being watched, remained. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My mind screamed for me to escape, but I was paralyzed by fear. And then, a loud crash broke the silence. It was coming from the floor below. I didn't think. My body acted on instinct. I turned and ran. The attic door slammed shut behind me as I stumbled down the narrow staircase, my hands clawing at the walls for balance. The crash from below echoed through the house like thunder, and I could hear something moving, something that should not have been there. The presence was following me. That oppressive, suffocating weight of fear. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the hallway, my flashlight still flickering weakly in my trembling hands. The house had become a maze, every corner, every shadow threatening something I couldn't see. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the floor creaked under my weight. I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever was here took me too. But then, I heard it again, the soft whispering. This time, it was louder, clearer. You shouldn't have opened the box. I froze, the cold dread washing over me once more. I turned toward the sound. The voice, it came from everywhere. It wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head. My father's words from the letters flashed in my mind. They know. They're watching. But who? What was it that had followed him and now followed me? I began to back away, but then the front door burst open with a violent force. The wind outside howled, carrying the scent of rain and decay. The dark figure, no, the shadow, was standing in the doorway. It was too late to escape. There was nowhere left to run. The figure didn't step forward, but its presence filled the entire space, blocking my way. My breath was shallow now, my legs barely holding me up. The shadow, or whatever it was coming closer, its form shifting, pulsating with a rhythmic, unnatural movement. You found the truth, it whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices speaking at once. And now, it's time to pay the price. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, as though I could blow it all away. But when I opened them again, it was standing right in front of me. Its cold breath swept over my face, making my skin prickle with ice. I could feel the weight of its gaze, but when I looked up, there was nothing to see, just the infinite blackness staring back at me. The house groaned, and in that moment, I knew I was trapped. Trapped in the darkness, trapped in the web my father had left behind, unable to break free. The letters, the journal, they had been his warning. But now it was too late. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed him. I took one final step backward, and my foot hit something hard. The floor beneath me gave way, and I fell through a hole I hadn't noticed before. The darkness swallowed me whole. When I landed, there was no sound, no movement, no air. I was alone. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I was dead. But the sharp pain in my side told me otherwise. I opened my eyes. I was in a small, hidden room surrounded by old furniture and broken objects. Dust hung in the air like a thick veil, and everything smelled musty and decayed. There were no windows, no way out. But then I saw something that made my heart stop. The journal. My father's journal. It was lying on the floor in front of me, as though it had been waiting for me. I reached out with trembling hands, lifting it to my chest. I could feel the weight of the answers it held, the truths that had haunted my father and now haunted me. I opened it, and the final entry stared back at me in my father's handwriting. It's too late. It's already here. It knows you. It will find you. The letters were never meant for me. They were for you. And then, the last line, run. But it was already too late for that. I could hear it, moving through the shadows. The whispering had returned, but this time it wasn't just in my head. It was in the room with me. You can't escape. The darkness was closing in once more. It was the kind of night where the world seemed too still, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you wonder if the world has stopped spinning. It was at that moment, when I opened my eyes in the dark, that I first saw them. Shadows. Moving, walking, and stretching across my room in ways they shouldn't. I tried to tell myself it was just the light from the street lamp outside casting strange shapes through the curtains. But no, these shadows weren't right. They were too alive. They didn't move like any shadow I had ever seen. They moved with purpose, with direction, as if they were aware of me, aware that I was watching them. I lay frozen under the covers, my heart racing in my chest. I tried to blink the sleep from my eyes, thinking maybe I was still dreaming, but no matter how many times I blinked, the shadows remained. A flicker to my left, and then another to my right. I watched as one of them stretched out across the floor, slowly creeping toward the bed. Its form was indistinct, just a shape in the darkness, nothing more, but I could feel its presence. A heavy, oppressive feeling that made my breath catch in my throat. I sat up suddenly, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. The cold wooden floor sent a chill through my feet as I stood. The shadows seemed to retreat at my movement, but when I glanced around, they were still there, lingering in the periphery of my vision. I took a few steps toward the window, hoping the light from the street would dispel the unsettling darkness around me. But as I drew closer, I noticed something more terrifying. The shadows weren't just on the floor or the walls. They were leaving marks behind, faint impressions on the wood, as if something heavy had passed over it. Something with weight and substance, leaving trails in its wake. I reached down to touch the marks. They felt cool, like the wood had been chilled by something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something from beyond. But before I could get a better look, the shadows shifted again. I saw them dart across the room, disappearing into the corner, only to reappear in another part of the room, like they were dancing just out of my reach. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the door, but before I could move, I heard it, the softest rustle, like fabric brushing against the floor. My eyes snapped to the sound, but there was nothing. No figure, no person, just the shadows, moving as if they had a life of their own. I stepped back, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a hallucination? Was I dreaming? But deep down, I knew this wasn't a dream. The shadows, they were real. And they were watching me. I reached for the light switch on the wall, desperate for some sense of normalcy, but the lights didn't respond. The room remained cloaked in darkness, save for those creeping shapes. They were closer now. I could hear them, moving across the floor like whispers on the wind. Suddenly, one of the shadows shifted in front of me, almost like a person standing in the corner of my room. I couldn't make out any features, no face or body, just a dark, shifting presence. It seemed to be watching me, waiting. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking in the silence. The shadow didn't answer, but I could feel it getting closer. And then, it was as if the shadow grew taller, stretching toward me, enveloping me in darkness. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls closing in as the air grew thick with an unnatural heaviness. I stumbled backward, but there was no escape. The shadows were everywhere now, on the ceiling, on the walls, under my feet. The space I had once known as safe and familiar was now a prison, and I could feel the eyes of the shadows on me, always watching. I closed my eyes, hoping it was all a nightmare, but when I opened them again, nothing had changed. They were still there. But now, I understood something more terrifying than I had ever imagined. They weren't just shadows. They were something else. Something that lived between the spaces of light and dark. Something that didn't belong in this world. Something that had been here long before I ever set foot in this house. And they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I could feel them closing in, but there was nowhere left to run. The shadows were alive, and they were coming for me. The morning light barely pierced through the drawn curtains, but it was enough to dispel the suffocating darkness that had gripped me the night before. I sat up in bed, my head still spinning from the unsettling encounter with the shadows. Had I been dreaming? I couldn't be sure. But the evidence was undeniable. The marks on the floor. I stood slowly, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My feet felt like they were sinking into the floor as I walked toward the spot where I had seen the shadows move. The air was still and thick, and the room felt colder than it should. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for me to make another mistake. I bent down to examine the floor, running my fingers along the wood. The marks were still there, faint but unmistakable. Trails that looked like something had dragged across the floor, leaving a residue of darkness. But it wasn't dust or dirt, it was something more sinister, a stain that couldn't be wiped away. I looked up at the walls, my gaze scanning every corner of the room. The shadows had been here. They had touched everything. My heart began to race as I realized that the marks were not confined to just the floor. They extended upward, up the walls and even on the ceiling. It was as if the shadows had moved across every surface, leaving behind traces of their existence. I quickly backed away from the marks, my breath shallow. What had happened last night? Was I losing my mind? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, hoping to call someone, anyone. But the screen was cracked, lines spreading like veins across its surface. The display flickered, showing nothing but static for a moment before it went completely black. My phone had been working fine just hours ago, but now it was dead. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't make sense. I stood there in the middle of the room, staring at the phone in my hand as the chill in the air seemed to deepen. The silence was suffocating, and the more I tried to focus on something, anything, the more I felt the weight of the shadows pressing down on me. It was then that I heard it, a soft thud from above, like something heavy being dropped on the floor of the attic. My blood ran cold. The attic. I had never paid much attention to the attic before. It was a small, forgotten space in the house, tucked away behind a door at the end of the hallway. The only time I had gone up there was to store old boxes and forgotten belongings. But now, with the sound echoing through the quiet house, I felt an irresistible pull to go up there. Against every instinct telling me to stay put, I moved toward the attic door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, as if my body was reluctant to open it. I could feel the temperature drop around me, a cold that seemed to radiate from the very air itself. The shadows, I realized, were everywhere. I could almost hear their whispers now, low and menacing, like a distant echo of something ancient. I turned the handle and opened the door, the creak of the hinges sharp in the silence. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep, narrow, and covered in dust. I took one step after another, the sound of my footfalls echoing through the house, filling the space with an unsettling rhythm. As I reached the top, I was met with an overwhelming smell, mold, dust, and something else. Something I couldn't place. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the light from a single bulb hanging above flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten trinkets, and a few dusty canvases stacked in the corner. But it was the old wooden chest at the far end of the room that caught my attention. It wasn't like the rest of the forgotten things in the attic. It looked different, like it didn't belong there. The chest was old, worn, and covered in a layer of dust, but it felt as though it had been placed there with purpose, as if someone or something had wanted it left untouched. I walked toward it, my steps hesitant. The closer I got, the more I could feel something strange in the air. A heavy presence, like the shadows had followed me up here. I reached for the latch and opened the chest. Inside, I found what I wasn't expecting, letters. Old, yellowed envelopes, each one sealed with a dark wax. They were stacked neatly, almost as if they had been placed there in a hurry. But as I reached for one of them, a chill ran down my spine. The name on the front was mine. My full name, written in careful handwriting that seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. I pulled the letter from the pile and held it in my hands. The weight of it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant for me to find. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my father's. The first letter was nothing more than a simple message, an ordinary letter to a friend, it seemed. But as I read through the following letters, the tone began to shift. There were references to things I didn't understand. Strange names, places, and events that didn't belong in the world I knew. My father spoke of a darkness, of a presence that followed him, watching his every move. And as the letters continued, his words grew more desperate. The last letter I read was different from the others. It was shorter, and the words were shaky, as if written in haste. It simply said, "They are here. They're watching you now. You must never open this chest again." I stared at the words, the blood draining from my face. The shadows, the marks on the floor, the feeling of being watched, it all made sense now. My father had known something dark and terrible, and now it was coming for me. And the worst part? I had opened the chest. I had triggered something I wasn't meant to understand. The shadows were no longer just in my room. They were here. And they were waiting. The letter slipped from my trembling hands, falling to the floor with a soft rustling sound. I couldn't take my eyes off the words. They're watching you now. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. The shadows had always been here, lurking in the periphery, but now they were closer, and they were waiting for something. Waiting for me. The attic seemed to close in around me. The air grew thick and suffocating, and I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards beneath me, as though something or someone was moving just out of sight. I snapped my gaze around, but there was nothing, only the old, dusty relics that filled the attic. But I could feel them. I could feel the shadows pressing against me, even in the dim light. They were watching, waiting. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, spinning with all the things I had learned from the letters, but the pieces didn't fit together. What was my father trying to protect me from? Who were they he spoke of? Why had he left me this cryptic message, this warning, and why had I opened the chest? I had to leave. I had to get out of the attic, away from the presence that felt so much closer now. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I pushed the letter back into the chest, slamming it shut with a force that echoed through the house. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. A shadow, moving just beyond the beam of light from the bulb overhead. It was tall and thin, almost like a figure, but it was dark, too dark to be real. I blinked, and it was gone. I had to get out. Now. I rushed down the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden steps. But as I reached the landing, the sound of movement came from the hallway behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Just the long, dark hallway stretching into the distance, empty and silent. A soft thud broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from the room behind me. I turned and fled down the hallway, my heart racing in my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, the dragging steps were always just behind me, following me, closing in on me. I could hear them, feel them, the presence growing stronger with every step I took. I reached the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. The room was empty, there was no one here. But the shadows, they were different now. They had grown longer, more defined. I could see them stretching across the walls, moving as though they were alive. My breath quickened. The shadows had always been there, but now they were reaching for me, almost as if they were calling me to them. The walls seemed to bend, the shadows warping and twisting in unnatural ways. I backed away, my hands shaking as I searched for the door, but there was no escape. Every corner of the room was filled with those dark figures, their forms stretching like long, grasping fingers. I spun around, desperately searching for any way out. The door to the hallway was too far. The windows? I couldn't reach them in time. And then, as if in response to my panic, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch closer. One by one, they started to gather in front of me, becoming more solid, more real. I could hear the whispering now. Low, guttural sounds that filled the air like a soft murmur. It was impossible to make out the words, but I could feel the weight of their presence pressing against me. They were speaking to me, calling to me, pulling me in. I took a step back, my mind racing. Was this what my father had been warning me about? Had he known that something would come for me if I uncovered the truth? I could feel the darkness closing in, its weight bearing down on me. I turned and ran, not caring where I went, just away from the shadows. I burst through the door into the kitchen, my breath coming in sharp gasps, and slammed it behind me. The room was empty, but I could still hear the faint sound of dragging steps from the hallway, always moving, always coming closer. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving. I had to think, had to find a way to stop this, stop whatever it was that was chasing me. And then, as I looked around the kitchen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The shadows weren't confined to the hallway anymore. They were here, in the kitchen with me, creeping along the walls, pooling in the corners like dark liquid. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. It was too late. The shadows were everywhere now. They were closing in on me, and I couldn't escape. I turned to run again, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, something that wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, standing in the doorway, watching me. A tall, thin shape, its features obscured by the darkness, but its presence undeniable. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, as if waiting for something. And then, slowly, it stepped forward, its form bending and shifting as it crossed the threshold. The room seemed to grow colder, and I felt the air thickening around me. The figure's footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment. It wasn't a shadow. It was real. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that I had been wrong all along. The shadows weren't just something in my house. They were a part of me now. A part of my past. Something that I could never escape. And they were never going to let me go. The figure stood there in the doorway, its presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating weight. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something real, something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The figure was tall, unnaturally so. Its limbs were long and angular, and its face was obscured by a hood of darkness, a void that seemed to absorb the light around it. There were no features, no eyes, only the endless blackness that stared back at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I stood frozen, my heart thundering in my chest, as the figure slowly stepped into the room. The air grew colder with every step it took, like a chill that seeped into my bones. I could hear its breath, or was it breathing, a low, rasping sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It moved with an eerie grace, its long arms swaying slightly as it walked toward me. The shadows seemed to pulse around it, shifting and twisting in unnatural patterns. I could feel them closing in, the air thick with their presence. The figure's movements were deliberate, as if it was in no hurry. It knew it had me trapped. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, trying to keep my distance. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as the figure slowly approached, its steps echoing in the otherwise silent room. Each time it moved, the shadows stretched and grew, as though it was feeding on the darkness around it. "Why are you here?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. My throat was tight, dry, and it felt like the words were being pulled from me against my will. The figure didn't respond, but it tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, weighing my very existence. The shadows in the room were growing more defined now, more real, their tendrils creeping along the floor and up the walls. I could feel the weight of them pressing against me, as though they were alive, hungry. I could hear their whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "Leave," I whispered, my hands shaking as I reached for the kitchen counter, trying to steady myself. But the shadows only grew bolder, creeping closer, pushing against my legs. The figure was still moving toward me, its long fingers outstretched, like it was going to touch me. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then, as it reached out, I felt it, a coldness, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into my skin. In that moment, I realized with a sickening clarity that the shadows weren't just following me. They were a part of me. I had seen them all my life, lurking in the corners of rooms, stretching across the floor when the light faded, but they were never this close. Never this real. I had ignored them. I had run from them, but they had always been there. Waiting. Watching. Now, they had come for me. The figure was almost within reach, its fingers brushing against my skin, and I finally found my voice. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my fear turning into something else, something raw, desperate. The figure stopped, its hand hovering just above my arm. It didn't speak, but I felt the weight of its presence bearing down on me, pushing the air out of my lungs. And then, in the deepest part of my mind, I heard a voice, low and guttural, as if coming from within the shadows themselves. "You belong to us." The words hit me like a slap. I could feel the truth in them, deep in my soul. These shadows, these creatures, they were tied to me. They had always been tied to me. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget them, they would always find me. The figure's hand finally made contact with my arm. It wasn't a touch, it was a force, a cold, crushing pressure that seemed to drain the warmth from my body. My vision blurred, and I felt my legs give way beneath me, but I couldn't fall. The shadows were holding me up, lifting me, their cold embrace wrapping around me like a net. I gasped for air, my mind racing. "No, I won't let you take me." But the shadows didn't care. They were everywhere now, crawling up my legs, wrapping around my chest, suffocating me. The figure leaned in closer, its hooded face looming in front of mine, and I could feel the darkness closing in, swallowing me whole. "You will come with us," the voice echoed in my mind, the words dragging me down, deeper into the abyss. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't escape. The shadows had me. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't just running from the shadows. I was running from myself. The next time I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the kitchen. I was standing in a place that felt both familiar and alien, a place where the air was thick with shadows, where the walls seemed to bend and shift like liquid. It was a space between spaces, a place where time itself seemed to lose its meaning. The figure stood before me, its form flickering in and out of the shadows, its dark presence overwhelming. I could feel its eyes on me, even though it had no face. And behind it, the shadows. They were all around me, swirling and shifting, like a living, breathing entity. "You've always known, haven't you?" The figure's voice rumbled, its words reverberating in the air. I nodded slowly, though I didn't want to admit it. I had always known. Deep down, I had always known that there was something wrong, something unfinished, something waiting to be uncovered. And now, I had uncovered it. The shadows were my past, my legacy. They were the darkness I had inherited, the darkness I had been born into. And now, it was time for me to face it. I stood there, alone in the suffocating dark, as the figure's voice echoed in my mind once more. "It's time to come home." I tried to move, to step back, but my legs felt heavy, like the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. The weight of the shadows around me was too much, pulling me down, binding me in place. I could feel their cold fingers wrap around my chest, tightening with every breath I took. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, no, hunted. The realization hit me like a wave. These weren't just shadows. They were the remnants of something ancient, something tied to me, to my very existence. They were my inheritance, a dark legacy that had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. The figure loomed closer, its presence growing stronger, more overwhelming. Its form flickered again, like it was both here and not here at the same time. It felt as though the very fabric of reality was bending around it. "You can't run from us anymore," it said, the voice vibrating in my bones. The sound was a dark hum, like the deepest part of the earth was speaking through it. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my body paralyzed by the oppressive darkness. The room, or whatever this place was, seemed to stretch endlessly, a void that swallowed everything. My thoughts, my fears, my past, they were all merging together in this space, and the shadows were feeding off them. "They've always been with you," the figure continued, its voice growing softer, but somehow more insistent. "Since the beginning, they've been waiting for you to see the truth." I shook my head, a weak denial escaping my lips. "No. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." But the figure was unfazed, its form shifting slightly, the darkness that clung to it growing more solid, more real. "It doesn't matter what you want. The shadows are part of you. And now, they will never leave you." The words cut through me like a knife. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. What did it mean? The shadows, my past, this figure, it was all tangled up in a web I could never untangle. I was trapped in my own darkness, a prisoner of my own fears. The air grew colder, and the walls around me seemed to close in, pressing tighter and tighter. The shadows stretched toward me like hands, reaching out to claim me. I couldn't fight them. There was no escape. I had always known it deep down. The whispers had been there, hidden just beneath the surface, but now they were louder than ever. The weight of them was suffocating, filling my lungs with fear. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. The figure's form wavered, then steadied, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "Because you can't escape what you are." And then, in a single motion, the figure extended its hand toward me, and the shadows surged forward. In that instant, I understood. The shadows weren't just a manifestation of fear. They were a reflection of me, of the darkness I had carried inside for as long as I could remember. I had spent my life running from it, hiding from it, but it had always been there, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to consume me. The hand reached me, cold and unyielding, and for a moment I thought I would be swallowed by the darkness completely. But then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let this dark legacy define me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed against the shadows, fighting back with everything I could muster. I didn't know how I was doing it, but I could feel the force of my will pushing against the darkness, pushing against the figure that sought to claim me. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the shadows retreated, dissipating into nothingness. The figure was gone, swallowed by the void it had come from, leaving me standing in the empty, silent space. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving, my body trembling from the effort. The room around me was still the same, silent, empty, but it felt different now. The weight was gone. The shadows were no longer pressing in on me. I had survived. But I was changed. The darkness, the shadows, they would never truly leave me. They were a part of me now, woven into the very fabric of who I was. I had faced them, fought them, but I knew they would return. They would always return. And when they did, I would be ready. Because the shadows that walked, they weren't just in the corners of my mind. They were in me. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, they would always follow. And I would always be their keeper. I don't know how long it's been since I first heard the voice, but I can still remember the exact moment. It wasn't a loud voice, not at first. It was a whisper, barely audible, coming from a place I couldn't pinpoint. But what really caught my attention was that it didn't sound like my own thoughts. It was something else. Someone else. It all began with an old camera I found while cleaning out the attic. It had been buried under boxes of forgotten junk, dusty books, cracked frames, old letters. I had never seen it before, or at least I couldn't remember it. It was a vintage camera, one of those old film types, heavy and solid with a lens that seemed to almost stare back at me. Something about it felt strange. But there was no harm in picking it up, right? Just an old relic, a forgotten piece of the past. I sat down on the dusty floor, examining it. The lens was slightly cracked, the leather strap was worn, and the buttons felt cold under my fingertips. I wondered why my parents kept it. They never spoke of it. I fiddled with the camera, pressing the buttons without much thought. I wasn't expecting much, just another old object to discard or store away. That's when the sound started. At first, I thought it was just static from the camera, but it quickly became something much more. A voice, faint but clear, echoed from the speaker. It wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but it sounded too personal. As if it knew me. As if it knew everything about me. Don't be afraid. I've been waiting. I froze. My fingers lingered on the camera's body, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice wasn't loud, but the words were unmistakable. It wasn't just some random noise or malfunction of the old device. The voice was directed at me. It knew me. It knew things no one else could know. I pulled the camera closer to my face, squinting into the viewfinder. I didn't know what I expected to see. Perhaps something was wrong with the lens? But the screen was black. No image. Just a deep, empty void. And then the voice spoke again. I see you, every moment. You can't hide from me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. My heart raced as I tried to process what was happening. Was this some kind of prank? No. It felt too real. Too immediate. The voice wasn't a recording. It was alive. The sound was coming from the camera itself. From the very lens I had been staring into. Who are you? I whispered, my voice shaky. What do you want from me? There was a long pause, then the voice answered, colder now, as if it was enjoying my discomfort. I want you to see everything. I want you to understand. The camera doesn't just capture moments, it captures reality. And it's always watching. The words sent a chill down my spine. I gripped the camera tighter, trying to steady my shaking hands. What was this? What was going on? I stood up, backing away from the attic corner where I had found the camera, but the voice followed. It didn't come from the camera anymore. It was in my head, whispering in my ears, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. You think you can just put me down? Forget me? No. You will never escape me. You are mine now. I felt a wave of dizziness sweep over me. I had to get rid of the camera. I had to get away from it, from whatever it was. But when I turned to leave the attic, the voice grew louder, more insistent. Leave and you'll never remember. I'll make you forget. But if you stay, I can show you everything. My pulse quickened. Forget? What did it mean by that? And what was it going to show me? Why had this thing started speaking to me? I turned back to the camera, staring at the lens. It felt like the camera itself was alive, waiting for me to make a choice. It was silent now, but I could feel the weight of its gaze even as I stood a few feet away. I don't know why I didn't just leave. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. But I raised the camera again, focusing the lens on the empty space in front of me. The voice came back, stronger this time. You're already part of it. You just don't know it yet. And now was when I realized something that sent a shiver through my bones. The voice wasn't just a voice. It was something more. Something that controlled the very air around me. Something that was attached to me. To my life. To everything I had ever known. I had unwittingly opened a door I wasn't sure I could ever close again. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted to. The camera hummed, its lens glinting in the dim attic light. I couldn't stop thinking about the camera. The weight of it, the voice that seemed to crawl into my mind, kept gnawing at me long after I put it down. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick, a malfunction, maybe some weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong with that camera, something I couldn't understand yet, but I could feel it in my bones. I had to know more. What had I uncovered? Was it really just some old camera, or was it something far more sinister? The voice had been too clear, too personal. It wasn't just static or interference. It was a presence, a conscious entity, aware of me and everything about me. For the next few days, I tried to avoid thinking about it. I placed the camera on the shelf in my living room and told myself I wouldn't touch it again. But every time I glanced at it, a chill would settle in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't help but wonder if it was watching me. Waiting. Then, on the fourth day, the voice returned. It started softly, like a whisper at the edge of my thoughts. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then the words became clearer, more distinct. It spoke from somewhere just behind me, as though it was standing right there in the room with me. I see you. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one. It was here again. You shouldn't have touched me, it continued, its tone tinged with something like amusement. But now that you have, you can never escape. I turned around quickly, expecting to see something, anything, but the room was empty. The same dull light filled the space, casting shadows across the floor. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the air was heavier, like the room was closing in on me. The camera, it had to be the source. It was the only thing that had changed, the only thing that seemed connected to these strange occurrences. I didn't want to, but I couldn't resist. I picked up the camera again, this time with a shaky hand. It was as if I was drawn to it, like an invisible force was pulling me in. The voice grew louder as I focused the lens, now pointed at the corner of the room. Stop, I whispered to myself. This is insane. but the voice didn't stop. "You are mine now," it said softly, almost tenderly. "You belong to me." I stared at the camera, my mind racing. I had no idea what was happening. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? Or was something far more terrifying at play? I tried to resist the urge to raise the camera to my eye, but I couldn't. It was as if the camera was controlling me, forcing my movements, guiding my thoughts. I pressed my eye to the viewfinder, half expecting to see nothing but the empty room. But that wasn't what happened. The image in the viewfinder wasn't the room I knew. It was darker, the walls twisted and warped in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and I could see something moving within it. Shadows. Figures. But they weren't human. They were shapes that defied logic, strange, fluid, almost transparent, yet somehow solid enough to leave an impression on the lens. They shifted in and out of view, as if they were alive but also part of the space itself. I blinked, unsure of what I was seeing. I took the camera away from my face, and the room was normal again. But when I looked back through the lens, the figures were still there, just beyond the edge of perception. "Who are they?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "They are me," the voice answered, its tone shifting to something darker, more dangerous. "And they are you." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. The room around me felt smaller, suffocating, like the walls were pressing in. I wanted to scream, to throw the camera out the window, to break it into 1,000 pieces. But something held me back. It wasn't just fear, it was a compulsion. An overpowering need to understand, to know what these figures were, what they meant. I brought the camera back up to my eye. The viewfinder was filled with the same dark, twisted space. The shapes were closer now, more defined, as if they had noticed me. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. They were watching me. And I realized then, with a terrible clarity, that they weren't just watching the room. They were watching me, through the camera. I pulled the camera away again, but it was too late. The figures in the lens had already begun to move closer. One of them, its shape indistinct, but somehow more present than the others, reached out, its hand brushing the lens. And in that moment, I felt a coldness seep through the camera, straight into my skin. The voice laughed softly, a dark, low sound that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. "You thought you could escape," it whispered, "but you never will." The camera in my hands seemed heavier now, as if it had gained weight, as if it was pulling me down with it. My pulse raced as I stood there, frozen, watching the figures come closer, knowing I had no choice but to confront whatever was happening, whatever I had unleashed. But no matter what I did, I couldn't look away. And that's when I realized maybe I didn't want to. I don't know how much time passed after I first saw the figures. It could have been seconds, or maybe hours. The world around me seemed to lose its meaning, becoming a blur of shifting shadows and distorted shapes. The only thing I could focus on was the camera, still pressed against my face, still showing that twisted view of reality, if it could even be called reality anymore. The figures moved closer, their features becoming more defined, but still strangely amorphous, as though they couldn't quite solidify. They were neither human nor anything I recognized. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were stuck between two dimensions, trapped in the lens, and yet, somehow, connected to the space around me. I tried to pull the camera away again, but it was no use. My hand shook uncontrollably, unable to release its grip. It was as if the camera had fused with my skin, the weight of it pulling me deeper into this world of shadows. The voice returned, now more insistent, more menacing. "You've seen us now. And we've seen you." I could feel the coldness of the figures pressing in on me, their intangible hands reaching through the viewfinder. The space around me seemed to stretch, becoming cavernous, but I couldn't move. It was as if the camera itself had become a portal, a gateway to this eerie realm that was slowly consuming me. "Why?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" There was a moment of silence, a brief pause, before the voice responded in a tone that chilled me to the core. "We want to know you," it said. "We want to be you. And now, you are one of us." I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The camera kept pulling me in, forcing my eyes back to the lens. And as I looked, I saw the figures move even closer, their forms becoming clearer, their movements more deliberate. One of them, the one that had reached out earlier, began to stretch its hand towards me, as if it wanted to touch me, to pull me into the frame with it. My breath caught in my throat. No. No. But my body didn't obey. My hand tightened around the camera, and I could feel the pull of its dark influence, drawing me deeper into the nightmare. The air grew colder, and I could hear the soft scratching noise of something moving just outside of my peripheral vision. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Yet, while I looked back through the lens, there it was again, the figure, its face now more distinct, though still unnatural. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were dark voids, absorbing everything around them as if it could see through me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to look away, to drop the camera, but it was impossible. It was as if my hands were locked in place, as if the camera had become an extension of my very soul, tethering me to this horrible vision. I realized then, I was trapped. Trapped in the lens, trapped in the shadows, with no way out. The voice whispered again, this time soft, almost gentle. "You'll never be alone again." The figures moved closer, and the one with the dark, empty eyes seemed to lean forward, pressing its face against the lens. I could feel its breath, cold and damp, creeping through the camera. My heart raced, my palms were sweating, and my legs felt like lead. I wanted to throw the camera away, to destroy it, but I couldn't. It was too late for that. The camera wasn't just an object anymore. It had become my prison. Suddenly, I heard something that didn't belong, a loud knock at the door. It echoed through the room, jarring me out of the trance I was in, breaking the suffocating grip of the camera. I pulled away from the viewfinder, gasping for air, my body shaking with fear. The knock came again, more urgent this time. I stumbled backward, my knees weak, and slowly placed the camera on the nearby table. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. What had just happened? Was I hallucinating? Was I losing my mind? The knock came once more, louder now, and I realized it was coming from the front door. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I answer it? Should I call for help? But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side of that door was somehow connected to the nightmare I had just experienced. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to let whatever it was into my home, into my life. But at the same time, I couldn't just sit here and wait. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and slowly approached the door. The air was thick with tension, the room growing colder with every passing second. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. I was certain that once I opened that door, nothing would ever be the same. Before I could make a decision, the door creaked open slightly on its own, the dark shadow of the hallway beyond stretching into the room. I didn't have to look through the peephole. I already knew. The camera, still sitting on the table, was watching. And whatever was behind that door, it was a part of the game now. I couldn't breathe. The door was open just enough to let the darkness seep through, like a slow-moving fog that wrapped itself around my legs. The air in the room grew colder, as if the shadows from beyond were reaching for me, pulling me toward them. I didn't know what was worse, the possibility of what waited for me on the other side, or the cold, empty feeling that had taken hold of me as I stood there, paralyzed. For a moment, I thought of closing the door, of locking myself away from whatever was out there. But the camera, still on the table, had a strange hold on me. I could feel its presence even though I wasn't looking through it anymore. I knew it was watching. And I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, whatever was behind that door, it was connected to the voice, the figures, to everything that had happened since I first picked up that damn camera. The knock came again, this time not a knock, but a thud, as if something heavy had been dropped on the floor just beyond the door. I took a step back. My legs shook, and my breath came in short gasps. I was torn between the need to run and the need to face whatever this was. The voice in the camera still echoed in my mind, whispering things I didn't understand. "You've seen us now. You've invited us in." I tried to turn away, but my feet refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the door that seemed to open wider with each passing second, like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. Then, as if summoned by my fear, the door creaked open all the way, revealing nothing but the hallway. No figures. No dark shapes. Just emptiness. I felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. From somewhere in the distance, I heard a soft whispering. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew louder, and they seemed to come from all around me, as if the walls themselves were speaking. I could hear my name. Over and over. James. James. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the familiar, dimly lit room. The camera. I didn't have to look at it to know something had changed. It was as if the camera knew me, knew my every fear. It was mocking me. I could feel the weight of it, pressing in on me, even from across the room. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to see. I had to understand. I walked slowly toward the table, my feet dragging like they were made of stone. The whispers were now louder, more urgent. I grabbed the camera, and as I lifted it to my face, the world around me shifted. It was as if I was no longer in the room. The shadows on the walls grew longer, stretching across the floor like they had a life of their own. The figures from the lens were back, their outlines shifting and warping with every blink. Their movements were faster now, more erratic, and they were closing in on me. I could feel their presence like a weight on my chest. I pressed the viewfinder to my eyes, my hand shaking. The world through the lens was distorted, but I could still make out shapes. Figures that weren't human, tall and slender, their limbs contorting in ways that defied logic. Their faces were blank slates, as though they hadn't been fully formed. I could hear their voices again, but this time they weren't speaking to me. They were speaking to each other. They know we're here. Not yet. But soon, they'll never be able to escape. I wanted to drop the camera, but I couldn't. It was like it was holding me, keeping me in place, forcing me to watch. The shadows were moving closer, faster now, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop even further. The whispers were growing louder, now mixed with a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Suddenly, the figures lunged. My breath caught in my throat as they seemed to reach out of the lens, their cold hands stretching toward me. I stumbled backward, but my legs gave out. I fell to the floor, the camera still pressed to my face, and the world around me twisted in agony. The growl became a roar, and I felt a pull, something deep inside me, like an invisible hand tugging at my soul. The room, the shadows, the figures, they were all part of something bigger, something I didn't understand. But I felt it creeping into my thoughts, like a disease. James. The voice was right behind me now, right in my ear. I turned my head, but there was nothing there, nothing except the camera, its lens gleaming in the dim light. And then, the voice spoke again, clear and final. "You will never escape us." I screamed, but it was too late. The camera's grip tightened around me, its presence overwhelming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figures, those shadowy, distorted beings, had claimed me, and there was no way out. As the darkness closed in, I realized the truth. The camera wasn't just a tool. It was a trap. And I had been its prey all along. And now, I was just another shadow. Just another part of the lens. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness around me. The room, once familiar and safe, had become something unrecognizable. The shadows weren't just on the walls anymore, they were crawling along the floor, stretching toward me like twisted hands desperate to pull me under. I could feel their cold touch on my skin, but when I looked down, there was nothing there. The camera remained in my hands, its cold weight now like an anchor, dragging me deeper into the nightmare. My fingers trembled uncontrollably as I pressed the viewfinder to my eye again, searching for anything that would make sense, anything that could help me understand. But all I saw were the distorted figures, their shapes flickering and warping like they were caught between dimensions. "James, you shouldn't have looked," one of the figures whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping against each other. I tried to look away, but the camera wouldn't let me. It felt as though it was part of me now, binding me to this twisted version of reality. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, in my mind, as though it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing second. "Leave us," I whispered to the shadows, but my voice sounded distant, as though it wasn't even mine anymore. It was drowned out by the cold laughter that echoed from the darkness. "You can't leave. Not now. Not after you've seen us," another figure taunted, its voice echoing all around me. "You're one of us now." The words hit me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, trying to push the camera away, but my body felt sluggish, as if it was no longer my own. The room seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were alive, feeding off my terror. And then, the camera's lens changed. The viewfinder, once showing only darkness and those terrifying shapes, now shifted. I saw something else. A reflection. A place I recognized, my own apartment, but distorted. The walls were cracked, the floor covered in dust, and everything was covered in a suffocating layer of darkness. But that wasn't the worst part. I could see myself in the reflection. My eyes were wide with terror, my face pale and gaunt. But it wasn't the reflection of me I recognized, it was the look in my eyes, the hollow emptiness, as though I wasn't really there at all. The shadows behind me were creeping in closer, curling around my legs like they were trying to claim me. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room. My heart skipped a beat. The shadows stopped moving. The camera trembled in my hands. I could feel it vibrating, as if it had a life of its own, as if it was responding to something. Something inside me told me to drop it, to destroy it. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to let go. It was as if it had become part of me, like a parasite feeding on my very soul. The camera's lens flickered again, and in that instant, the world around me warped. The shadows that had been creeping closer became more defined, more solid, like they were reaching out from the screen itself. And then, I saw it. A figure, tall, dark, and twisted, emerged from the lens, its features indistinct, like a shadow, but its presence was overwhelming. It moved toward me with an unsettling slowness, as though it was savoring every moment of my terror. "No," I gasped, but it was too late. The figure reached out with long, gnarled fingers, and as they touched my skin, I felt a coldness unlike anything I'd ever known. It wasn't just cold, it was empty. A void that sucked away everything inside me. My thoughts, my memories, my very essence. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. My body refused to respond, as though the shadows had taken control of me completely. The camera was no longer in my hands, but I could still feel its presence, its weight pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was in my apartment. Everything was normal. The walls were intact, the floor was clean. The shadows were gone. I was sitting in my living room, the camera lying on the table in front of me, still intact, still waiting. But something was different. The silence felt too loud, too thick. The shadows didn't just disappear. They were still there, lurking in the corners of my vision, just out of sight. I could feel them watching me, waiting for me to look again, to use the camera once more. And I knew, deep down, that they were always going to be there. Because the camera hadn't just shown me their world. It had pulled me into it. And now, there was no way out. I stood up, my body numb, my thoughts scattered. I glanced at the camera one last time. And in that moment, I understood. The camera had always been the key. The lens wasn't just a way to capture reality, it was a doorway. A portal to something darker, something beyond our understanding. And now, it was too late. The shadows had claimed me, and they would never let me go. I could still hear their voices, faint whispers in the back of my mind. "You will never escape," they said. "We are always with you." And somewhere, deep in the darkness, I heard the sound of a camera's click. The next frame had been captured. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.